Before the first temple rose from ancient stone, before the name Zeus echoed across mountaintops and valleys, before mortals ever looked up at the stars and wondered about their place in the cosmos, there was something far more mysterious. There was chaos. Not the chaos we know today, with its sense of disorder and confusion, but something deeper, more profound. The original void, the emptiness that came before everything else existed. The story of Greek mythology is not simply a collection of tales about gods and monsters, heroes and villains. It is something far more extraordinary. It is a vision of how an entire civilization understood existence itself, how they made sense of creation, destruction, love, loss, and the endless mystery of what it means to be human in a universe that seems both beautiful and terrifying. Tonight we will journey through the full chronology of this remarkable mythology. We will begin at the very beginning, in that primordial darkness before time had meaning, and we will follow the story all the way to its twilight when the gods themselves began to fade into memory and legend. This is not just ancient history. These myths shaped how people understood their world for thousands of years. They explained why the seasons changed, why storms raged across the sea, why love could bring such joy and such pain. They gave meaning to suffering and hope to despair. They created a framework for understanding power, justice, fate, and freedom that still echoes through our stories today. Picture, if you will, a time before time, a darkness so complete that it had no edges, no boundaries. No light had ever existed to define where one thing ended and another began. No sound had ever broken the silence. This was chaos, and from this infinite emptiness, everything we know and everything we can imagine would eventually emerge. The ancient Greeks who first told these stories were not primitive people telling simple tales around campfires. They were sophisticated thinkers, philosophers, poets, and storytellers who understood that the deepest truths about existence could not be captured in simple facts or logical arguments. They needed stories. They needed myths that could hold the weight of all human experience, from the cosmic to the intimate, from the divine to the mortal. So let us begin this journey together, from the birth of the cosmos to the fading of the gods. Let us explore how order emerged from chaos, how love and strife shaped the universe, how mortals and immortals became forever intertwined in an epic that has never truly ended. The myths are not gone. They live on in every story we tell about power and justice, about love and loss, about the eternal human search for meaning in an infinite universe. In the beginning was chaos, not the frantic disorder we might imagine today, but a yawning void, an endless gap in existence where nothing had form or substance. The ancient Greek word itself means a gaping chasm, like the moment when you stand at the edge of a deep canyon and feel the vertigo of infinite space stretching below you. This was the first thing that existed, and yet it was the absence of everything. But from this emptiness, something miraculous began to happen. The void itself began to give birth to the first beings of existence. Gaia emerged, the Earth herself, not as a planet spinning in space, but as the foundation of all life, the nurturing mother from whom everything solid and real would spring. She was followed by Tartarus, the deep abyss that would become the prison of the damned, a place so far beneath the earth that an anvil dropped from the surface would fall for 9 days and 9 nights before reaching its depths. Then came Nyx, the primordial night, clothed in darkness and mystery. She was not simply the absence of light, but a powerful force in her own right, so ancient and revered that even Zeus himself would later show her respect. With her came Eros, not the playful cherub of later myths, but the fundamental force of attraction and desire that would bind all things together. Without Eros, nothing would seek connection with anything else. The cosmos would remain forever scattered and alone. These first beings were unlike anything that would come after them. They were not gods in the way we usually think of gods, with human personalities and petty jealousies. They were living embodiments of the basic forces that make existence possible. Gaia was not just a goddess who happened to rule the earth. She was the earth, in all its fertile, nurturing, sometimes destructive power. From Gaia came more wonders. She gave birth to Uranus, the starry sky, who would become both her son and her husband in the strange logic of mythic time. She also brought forth Pontus, the ancient sea, and the mountains that would rise from her surface like the backbone of the world. But perhaps most importantly, she created Erebus, the deep darkness that exists beneath the earth. And from the union of Erebus and Nyx came Ether, the bright upper air, and Hemera, the day. Already we can see the pattern that would shape all of Greek mythology. Creation comes through union, often between seemingly opposite forces. Light emerges from darkness, order from chaos, love from the void. But these unions are not always peaceful. They carry within them the seeds of conflict that will drive the stories for ages to come. Uranus, the sky, spread himself over Gaia, the earth, and from their union came the first generation of divine children. These were the Titans, beings of immense power and cosmic significance. There were 12 of them, 6 male and 6 female, and their names still echo through our language today. Oceanus, the great river that the ancients believed encircled the entire world. Hyperion, the blazing one who would father the sun and moon. Themis, the embodiment of divine law and order. Iapetus, who would become the father of Prometheus, the firebringer. But Uranus was not content to simply father these mighty children. He feared them, sensing perhaps that they would eventually challenge his rule. So he pushed them back into Gaia's womb, refusing to let them see the light of day. The earth groaned under the weight of these imprisoned titans, and Gaia herself began to suffer from their confinement. In her pain and anger, Gaia forged the first weapon ever made, a great sickle of adamant, harder than any earthly metal. She offered it to her children, asking which of them would be brave enough to overthrow their father. Only Cronus, the youngest of the Titans, was willing to take up the blade. He waited until Uranus came to embrace Gaia in the darkness, and then he struck, castrating his father with one terrible blow. The blood that fell from Uranus's wound did not simply disappear. It fell upon Gaia, and from it sprang new forms of life. The Furies were born from this blood, ancient goddesses of vengeance who would pursue those who committed crimes against family. The Giants emerged too, beings of enormous strength who would later challenge the gods themselves. And from the foam where Uranus's severed parts fell into the sea, Aphrodite would eventually rise, the goddess of love born from an act of violence. With Uranus overthrown, Cronus became the new ruler of the cosmos, but the cycle of violence had only just begun. The son had struck down the father, but he had also learned a terrible lesson about the nature of power and the danger of children who might grow strong enough to challenge their parents. This act of violence against Uranus had consequences that rippled through the cosmos like waves across a still pond. The Titans, finally free from their imprisonment, emerged into the light of creation. Each one carried within them a portion of the cosmic forces that would shape the world. Oceanus became the great river that encircled all the lands, his waters flowing in an endless stream around the edges of the earth. His wife Tethys became the mother of all the rivers and springs that would nourish the world. Hyperion, whose name means the one who goes above, took dominion over the heavenly light. He would father Helios the sun, Selene the moon, and Eos the dawn. These 3 children would ride across the sky each day and night, bringing light and time to the world below. Theia, his sister and wife, became the goddess of sight and the shining light of the clear blue sky. Coeus represented the questioning mind, the divine intelligence that seeks to understand the mysteries of existence. His wife Phoebe was associated with the prophetic power of the moon, the ability to see into the future and understand the will of fate. From their union would come Leto, who would one day bear the great god Apollo. Crius governed the heavenly constellations, the patterns of stars that would guide sailors and mark the passage of seasons. Iapetus, whose name means the piercer, would become the father of 4 sons who would play crucial roles in the relationship between gods and mortals. Atlas, who would hold up the sky itself. Menuetius, who would be struck down by Zeus for his hubris. Epimetheus, the one who thinks too late. And most importantly, Prometheus, the one who thinks ahead, who would bring fire to humanity and suffer terribly for his compassion. But perhaps the most significant of all was Cronus himself, now the ruler of this new cosmic order. He had learned from his father's mistake and was determined not to be overthrown by his own children. The ancient prophecy whispered that one of his sons would grow strong enough to defeat him, just as he had defeated Uranus. This knowledge filled him with dread and paranoia. Cronus took as his queen Rhea, another of the Titans, and she began to bear him children. But as each child was born, Cronus would snatch the infant from her arms and swallow it whole, ensuring that none of his offspring could grow strong enough to challenge his rule. First came Hestia, the gentle goddess of the hearth, then Demeter, who would become the goddess of the harvest. Hera followed, destined to become the queen of the gods, then Hades, the future ruler of the underworld, and finally Poseidon, who would one day command the seas. With each child that disappeared into Cronus's gullet, Rhea's grief grew deeper. She watched her husband become the very monster that his father had been, imprisoning their children not in the earth but in his own body. The cycle of violence and fear was repeating itself, and the cosmos groaned under the weight of this terrible pattern. The earth itself began to change during this time. Gaia, having witnessed the violence of her son against her husband, began to nurture other forms of life. She brought forth the Cyclopes, one-eyed giants of incredible skill who would one day forge the weapons of the gods. She also gave birth to the Hecatonchires, the hundred-handed ones, beings of such terrible power that even the Titans feared them. But Cronus, paranoid and cruel, cast these new children into the depths of Tartarus, just as his father had imprisoned the Titans. The earth shook with Gaia's anger, and she began to plot once again. She had seen 2 generations of her children turn to violence and oppression, and she knew that change would only come through yet another act of rebellion. The cosmos was no longer the simple void it had been in the beginning. It was now a complex realm of competing forces, divine beings with their own desires and fears, and an underlying tension between the generations that would shape every story to come. The Titans ruled from their positions of power, but beneath the surface, new forces were stirring. In the hidden places of the earth, Gaia was preparing for another revolution, one that would bring forth beings even more powerful than the Titans themselves. The stage was set for the next great transformation. The cycle of creation and destruction, of sons overthrowing fathers, of order emerging from chaos only to face new challenges, would continue. But this time, the changes would be so profound that they would echo through every story that followed, shaping the very nature of divinity itself and determining the fate of both gods and mortals for all time to come. Under the rule of Cronus, the world entered what would later be remembered as the Golden Age, a time of abundance and peace that mortals would look back upon with deep longing. The earth was young and fertile, yielding its fruits without the need for hard labor. There was no war, no famine, no disease. The seasons flowed gently into one another, and death, when it came, was like falling into a peaceful sleep. Human beings lived long, healthy lives, their hearts free from the anxieties and sorrows that would later plague their descendants. Yet beneath this surface tranquility, a terrible drama was unfolding. Cronus, haunted by the prophecy that one of his sons would overthrow him just as he had overthrown his father, continued his grim ritual. Each time Rhea bore a child, he would devour it immediately, trapping his offspring in the darkness of his belly. 5 children had already disappeared in this way, and with each one, Rhea's heart broke a little more. The Titan Queen wandered the earth in her grief, seeking solace from her mother Gaia. The ancient earth goddess watched her daughter's suffering with growing anger. She had seen this pattern before, this cycle of fathers fearing their sons, of power corrupting even the most noble intentions. Cronus had begun as a liberator, freeing his siblings from imprisonment, but now he had become a tyrant worse than his father had ever been. When Rhea became pregnant for the 6th time, she could bear the thought of losing another child no longer. She went to Gaia in secret, pleading for help to save this baby from his father's terrible hunger. The earth goddess smiled grimly and told her daughter of a plan that would require great courage and perfect timing. When the time came for the birth, Rhea traveled far from the palace of Cronus to the island of Crete. There, in a hidden cave on Mount Ida, she gave birth to a son whose cries would one day shake the foundations of the cosmos. This was Zeus, destined to become the king of gods, but for now, just a vulnerable infant who needed protection from his cannibalistic father. Gaia helped Rhea wrap a large stone in swaddling clothes, making it look exactly like a newborn baby. When Rhea returned to Cronus, she presented him with this bundle, watching with a mixture of terror and satisfaction as her husband swallowed the stone without hesitation, believing he had consumed his sixth child. The real Zeus remained hidden in the Cretan cave, nursed by the nymph Amalthea, who sometimes took the form of a goat to feed him with her milk. The Curetes, young divine warriors, danced and clashed their shields outside the cave whenever the baby cried, drowning out the sound so that Cronus would not discover the deception. They moved with wild, ecstatic energy, their dancing becoming one of the first religious rituals, a celebration of life hidden from the forces of destruction. As Zeus grew in his secret sanctuary, he developed the strength and cunning that would serve him well in the trials to come. But he was not the only one preparing for change. Throughout the cosmos, other forces were stirring, ready to play their parts in the great transformation that was approaching. Atlas, the mighty son of Iapetus, had grown to enormous size and strength, capable of holding up the very sky itself. His brother Prometheus possessed a gift that set him apart from all other immortals, the ability to see far into the future and understand the consequences of actions before they were taken. He knew that the age of the Titans was drawing to a close, and he began to position himself carefully for what was to come. Prometheus understood something that most of the other Titans did not. The next phase of cosmic evolution would not simply be another repetition of the old pattern of violent overthrow. This time, intelligence and strategy would triumph over brute force. The new rulers would need to be more than just powerful. They would need to be wise, capable of governing not just through fear, but through justice and order. Meanwhile, in the depths of Tartarus, the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires remained imprisoned, their incredible powers locked away by Cronus's paranoia. These beings possessed abilities that could tip the balance of any cosmic war. The Cyclopes were master craftsmen, capable of forging weapons that could harness the fundamental forces of nature. The Hecatoncheires had the strength of 100 warriors each, with 50 heads and 100 arms that could rain destruction upon any enemy. When Zeus came of age and learned the truth about his heritage, he knew that he could not defeat Cronus and the Titans alone. His first act was to seek out Metis, the Titaness of wise counsel, whose name meant cunning intelligence. She prepared a special drink that would cause Cronus to disgorge all the children he had swallowed, returning Zeus's siblings to the world of the living. The plan worked perfectly. When Cronus drank the potion, thinking it was ordinary wine, his stomach convulsed and he vomited up first the stone that Rhea had substituted for Zeus, and then all 5 of his other children. They emerged fully grown and filled with divine power, ready to join their youngest brother in overthrowing their tyrannical father. But Zeus knew that even with his siblings at his side, the Titans were still formidable enemies. His next move was to descend into Tartarus and free the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires. In gratitude for their liberation, the Cyclopes forged for Zeus the weapon that would become his symbol, the thunderbolt that could split the sky and shake the earth with its power. For Poseidon, they made a trident that could command the seas and cause earthquakes. For Hades, they crafted a helmet of invisibility that would allow him to move unseen through any realm. The stage was now set for the most terrible war the cosmos had ever witnessed. On one side stood the Titans, led by Cronus, defenders of the old order with all its power and accumulated wisdom. On the other side were the Olympians, as Zeus and his siblings came to be called, young and fierce and determined to create a new kind of divine rule. This was the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans, and it would rage for 10 long years, shaking the very foundations of existence and determining the future of both gods and mortals for all the ages to come. The war began not with a single battle, but with a series of cosmic upheavals that announced to all creation that the old order was being challenged. Zeus hurled his first thunderbolt across the sky, splitting the heavens with light and sound. The earth trembled as Poseidon struck the sea with his trident, causing massive waves to crash against the shores. The very air itself seemed to crackle with divine energy as the two sides prepared for conflict. Cronus rallied his fellow Titans to his cause, reminding them of their ancient glory and the harmony they had brought to the cosmos. Most of them stood with him, unable to imagine a world ruled by these young upstarts who had never known the responsibility of cosmic governance. But some of the Titans chose differently. Oceanus, the great river that encircled the world, remained neutral, understanding perhaps that this conflict was necessary for the cosmos to evolve. Prometheus, with his gift of foresight, quietly allied himself with Zeus, knowing that the young god represented the future. The battles raged across every realm of existence. In the sky, Zeus and his thunderbolts clashed with the elemental powers of the older gods. On the earth, the very landscape was torn apart and reformed as divine forces collided. Even the underworld shook as the foundations of reality were tested by this cosmic struggle. The Hecatonchires proved to be crucial allies for Zeus. With their 100 hands, they could hurl massive boulders like a constant rain of destruction, overwhelming even the mightiest titans. Their 50 heads could watch in all directions at once, making them impossible to surprise or outflank. These strange beings who had been imprisoned and forgotten now became the instruments of cosmic change. For 10 years, the war continued, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Titans had experience and the established order on their side, but the Olympians had the fierce energy of youth and the powerful weapons forged by the Cyclopes. The cosmos itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which vision of divine rule would triumph. Finally, in a climactic battle that shook the pillars of creation, Zeus managed to bind the Titans with chains forged from the same adamantine metal that had made Cronus' sickle. One by one, the great powers of the previous age were cast down into Tartarus, the deep abyss from which they would never return. Atlas, who had fought most fiercely against the new order, was given the special punishment of holding up the sky itself, bearing the weight of the heavens on his shoulders for all eternity. Cronus, the king who had ruled during the Golden Age and then become a tyrant consumed by fear, was imprisoned in the deepest part of Tartarus. The cycle of sons overthrowing fathers had come full circle, but Zeus was determined that it would not continue. He had seen what paranoia and fear could do to even the most noble ruler, and he resolved to govern differently. The victory of the Olympians marked the end of one cosmic age and the beginning of another. The universe was no longer ruled by the primal forces of nature alone, but by gods who combined power with intelligence, strength with justice. The cosmos was about to enter a new phase of its existence, one that would be far more complex and dramatic than anything that had come before. But the cycle of creation was far from over. For the sun, Zeus had indeed become the new ruler, but he would soon discover that power brings its own challenges, and that even the mightiest king must face the possibility that his own reign might someday come to an end. With the Titans defeated and imprisoned in the depths of Tartarus, Zeus stood victorious as the new ruler of the cosmos. But victory in war and success in governance are two very different things. The young god faced the enormous challenge of organizing a universe that had been shattered by 10 years of divine conflict. The very fabric of reality needed to be rewoven, and new laws needed to be established for this transformed world. Zeus's first act was to divide the cosmos among his brothers, ensuring that power would not be concentrated in the hands of a single ruler as it had been under Cronus. This was a revolutionary decision, born from the hard lessons of the previous age. He had seen how absolute power had corrupted his father, turning a liberator into a tyrant, and he was determined not to repeat that mistake. The three brothers cast lots to determine their realms. Zeus claimed the sky and the heavens as his domain, becoming the ruler of the upper air, the storm clouds, and all the space between earth and stars. From his throne, he could see everything that transpired in the mortal world below and in the divine realms above. Poseidon received dominion over all the waters of the earth, the vast oceans that surrounded the lands, the rivers that flowed through valleys, and the springs that bubbled up from underground sources. His realm was wild and unpredictable, reflecting his own tempestuous nature. Hades, the eldest of the three, was given rule over the underworld, the shadowy realm where the souls of the dead would come to rest. This was not a punishment, but a position of enormous responsibility. Someone had to govern the afterlife to ensure that justice was done and that the dead found their proper place in the cosmic order. Hades accepted this solemn duty, understanding that his realm, though dark and feared by mortals, was essential to the balance of existence. The sisters also found their places in this new divine hierarchy. Hestia, the gentlest of them all, became the goddess of the hearth and home. the sacred fire that burned at the center of every household and every temple. Her flame represented the continuity of family and community, the warmth that brought people together in love and fellowship. Demeter took charge of the harvest and the fertility of the earth, ensuring that crops would grow and that mortals would have food to sustain their lives. Hera, proud and regal, became Zeus's queen and the goddess of marriage and family. But their relationship would prove to be far more complicated than the simple partnership Zeus had envisioned. Hera possessed a fierce intelligence and a deep sense of justice that sometimes put her at odds with her husband's decisions. She would not be content to simply stand in Zeus's shadow, but would become a power in her own right, shaping the destiny of gods and mortals through her own actions. The Olympians established their court on Mount Olympus, the highest peak in the known world, so tall that its summit was hidden in clouds and touched the very dome of the sky. Here they built palaces of such beauty and magnificence that they seemed to be made of crystallized light itself. The architecture defied mortal understanding, with halls that stretched into infinity and columns that seemed to be carved from solidified music. But Zeus understood that divine rule required more than impressive palaces and grand ceremonies. The cosmos needed order, and order required laws that even the gods themselves would respect. He established the concept of divine justice, the idea that there were principles of right and wrong that transcended the personal desires of individual deities. This was perhaps his greatest innovation, the foundation upon which all future governance would rest. Yet even as Zeus worked to create this new order, challenges arose that tested his wisdom and resolve. The most significant of these came from an unexpected source, one of the Titans who had actually aided Zeus during the war. Prometheus, whose name meant forethought, had used his gift of prophecy to choose the winning side in the cosmic conflict, but his motivations went deeper than simple political calculation. Prometheus possessed something that set him apart from most of the other immortals, a genuine compassion for the mortal beings who struggled to survive in the harsh world below. These humans had been created during the age of the Titans, fashioned from clay and given the spark of life, but they were weak and vulnerable creatures. They had no natural weapons like the claws and fangs of wild beasts, no thick fur to protect them from cold, no wings to escape from danger. Watching these mortals shiver in their caves, scraping together meager meals and dying young from exposure and disease, Prometheus felt his heart move with pity. He saw in them a potential that the other gods missed, an ability to grow and learn and create that might one day make them worthy companions to the immortals themselves. But they needed help. They needed the tools that would allow their potential to flourish. The most important of these tools was fire, the divine flame that could cook food, provide warmth, light the darkness, and serve as the foundation for all the arts of civilization. Fire belonged to the gods alone, and Zeus had forbidden its sharing with mortals. In his view, maintaining the distinction between divine and human was essential to cosmic order. If mortals became too powerful, they might challenge the gods themselves, repeating the cycle of conflict that had already caused so much destruction. But Prometheus saw things differently. He believed that helping mortals develop their abilities would actually strengthen the cosmic order, not weaken it. Humans who were grateful for divine gifts would become faithful worshippers, offering prayers and sacrifices that would honor the gods and acknowledge their supremacy. The relationship between divine and mortal could be one of mutual benefit rather than simple domination. Driven by this vision, Prometheus made a decision that would have enormous consequences for both gods and mortals. He stole fire from the divine realm, carrying it down to earth hidden in a hollow reed. When he gave this gift to humanity, he did more than simply provide them with a useful tool. He gave them the foundation of civilization itself, the power to transform their environment and create cultures of beauty and complexity. The humans received this gift with wonder and gratitude, using it to cook their food, warm their homes, and extend their activities into the night hours. They learned to forge metal tools and weapons, to create pottery and works of art, to build cities and develop systems of law and governance. The spark of divine fire that Prometheus had given them became the catalyst for all human achievement. But Zeus was furious when he discovered what Prometheus had done. The king of the gods saw this act not as compassion but as defiance, a challenge to the divine order that he had worked so hard to establish. If one god could simply ignore divine law and act according to his personal judgment, what would prevent others from doing the same? The careful balance of the cosmos could collapse into chaos once again. The punishment Zeus devised for Prometheus was as terrible as it was eternal. He commanded that the Titan be chained to a mountain peak in the Caucasus, bound with unbreakable adamantine shackles that would hold him fast for all eternity. But this was only the beginning of his torment. Each day, an enormous eagle would descend from the sky and tear open Prometheus's chest, devouring his liver while he remained conscious and in agony. Since Prometheus was immortal, his liver would regenerate each night, growing back completely so that the torture could begin anew with each sunrise. This was not simply punishment, but a cosmic lesson, a demonstration to all divine beings that defying the will of Zeus would result in suffering beyond imagination. The screams of Prometheus echoed across the mountains, a constant reminder of the price of rebellion. Yet Zeus's anger was not satisfied with punishing Prometheus alone. The mortals who had received the stolen fire must also learn that accepting gifts from rebellious gods came with consequences. Zeus decided to create a new kind of being, one that would bring both wonder and sorrow into the human world. Working with Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, Zeus fashioned the first woman from clay and divine breath. This was Pandora, whose name meant all gifted, for each of the gods contributed something to her creation. Aphrodite gave her beauty that would stop men's hearts and cloud their judgment. Athena clothed her in shining garments and taught her the arts of weaving and crafting. Apollo blessed her with musical ability and a voice that could charm any listener. Hermes, the messenger god, gave her the gift of persuasive speech, but also a curiosity that could never be fully satisfied. When Pandora was complete, she was the most beautiful creature that had ever existed, so lovely that even the gods themselves gazed upon her with wonder. But hidden within her beauty was a purpose that served Zeus's plan for divine justice. She was sent to Earth as a bride for Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus, whose name meant afterthought, the one who understood the consequences of actions only after they had already occurred. Despite his brother's warnings to accept no gifts from Zeus, Epimetheus was enchanted by Pandora's beauty and made her his wife. She brought with her a large jar, sealed with divine locks and covered with warnings that it must never be opened. But Pandora's divine curiosity grew stronger each day as she wondered what treasures or secrets might be hidden within. The jar contained all the sorrows and troubles that Zeus intended to release into the human world. Inside were disease and old age, war and famine, jealousy and hatred, despair and madness. These were the shadows that would balance the light of Prometheus's fire, ensuring that mortals would never become too proud or too powerful, never forget their dependence on divine favor. Finally, Pandora's curiosity overcame her caution, and she opened the jar just enough to peek inside. Immediately, all the evils flew out like a dark cloud, spreading across the earth and settling into the hearts and lives of human beings. For the first time, mortals experienced the pain of illness, the sorrow of death, the agony of conflict and betrayal. The golden age of innocence was over, replaced by an age of struggle and suffering. But Zeus's plan included one final element, a demonstration that divine justice contained mercy as well as punishment. At the very bottom of the jar, beneath all the sorrows, lay one last gift. This was hope, the ability to believe that suffering would end, that tomorrow might be better than today, that even in the darkest moments there remained the possibility of joy and redemption. Hope did not escape when Pandora opened the jar. It remained trapped inside, available to humanity but never overwhelming them, never making them forget the reality of their condition. This was perhaps Zeus's most subtle creation, the recognition that mortals needed both the awareness of their limitations and the strength to continue striving despite them. The introduction of Pandora and her jar marked a fundamental change in the relationship between gods and mortals. No longer would humans live in simple innocence, accepting divine gifts without understanding their cost. They would have to navigate a complex world where divine favor came with divine testing, where every blessing might hide a curse, where wisdom meant understanding the true nature of existence. The Olympians themselves began to take on more defined roles in this new cosmic order. Zeus established the great festivals and rituals that would allow mortals to honor the gods properly, creating a structured system of worship that acknowledged divine power while providing humans with ways to seek divine favor. The sacrifice of animals, the pouring of wine libations, the burning of incense, all became part of an elaborate dance between mortal and immortal realms. Hera, despite her troubled relationship with Zeus, proved herself to be a formidable goddess in her own right. She became the protector of marriage vows and family bonds, ensuring that the sacred relationships that held society together were respected and maintained. Her temples became places where wives could seek justice for unfaithful husbands, where marriages could be blessed, where the continuation of family lines could be assured. Poseidon's domain over the seas made him one of the most powerful and unpredictable of the Olympians. Sailors would pray to him before every voyage, offering sacrifices to ensure safe passage across his watery realm. But Poseidon's moods were as changeable as the sea itself, capable of sudden storms that could destroy the mightiest ships or gentle breezes that could speed travelers safely to their destinations. The rise of Olympus was not just about establishing divine rule, but about creating a new kind of cosmic order where power was balanced by responsibility, where justice was tempered by mercy, where the relationships between gods and mortals could evolve and deepen over time. The universe had become more complex, more interesting, and infinitely more dramatic than it had been in the simple days when chaos reigned over the void. Yet even as this new order took shape, the seeds of future conflicts were already being planted. The gods themselves were not immune to the passions and weaknesses that affected mortals. They experienced love and jealousy, pride and anger, ambition and disappointment. Their immortal lives stretched out before them endlessly, and the boredom and restlessness that came with eternal existence would drive them to seek new adventures, new challenges, new ways to test their power and influence. The stage was set for the great stories that would follow, tales of divine love affairs and mortal heroes, of quests and transformations, of the eternal struggle between fate and free will that would define the Greek understanding of existence for countless generations to come. As the Olympians settled into their roles as rulers of the cosmos, they began to observe the strange and fascinating creatures that inhabited the earth below. Humanity had been evolving since its first creation, passing through different phases of existence that reflected the changing relationship between mortal and divine realms. The poet Hesiod would later describe these phases as the ages of man, each one representing a different stage in the long journey of human civilization. The first of these was the Golden Age, which had flourished under the gentle rule of Cronus before his descent into tyranny. During this blessed time, humans lived lives of such ease and contentment that they seemed almost divine themselves. The earth provided everything they needed without requiring labor or struggle. Fruit hung heavy on the trees year-round, grain grew wild in the fields, and honey dripped freely from the oak trees. The climate was perpetually mild, with no harsh winters or scorching summers to test human endurance. In this golden time, humans knew nothing of war or violence, sickness or old age. They lived for hundreds of years, their bodies remaining young and strong until the very end of their lives. When death finally came, it was as gentle as falling asleep, a peaceful transition from one state of being to another. There was no fear, no pain, no awareness of mortality that might cast a shadow over their happiness. These golden race humans possessed a natural wisdom and goodness that made them beloved by the gods. They lived in harmony not only with each other but with all the creatures of the earth. Lions played with lambs, eagles nested peacefully beside doves, and humans walked among wild animals without fear or aggression. The very concept of predator and prey did not exist in this perfect world. But when Cronus fell and Zeus established the new order, the Golden Age came to an end. The humans of that blessed time did not simply disappear, however. According to the ancient stories, they were transformed into benevolent spirits who continued to watch over the earth, protecting and guiding their mortal descendants. These golden spirits became the guardians of justice and righteousness, invisible helpers who whispered wisdom into the ears of those who sought to live good lives. The second phase of human existence was the Silver Age, which emerged under the early rule of Zeus. The humans of this era were still blessed compared to later generations, but they had lost the perfect innocence and harmony of their golden predecessors. They lived for only 100 years, spending the first century of their lives as children under their mother's care, never truly maturing until the very end of their existence. Silver Age humans were beautiful and strong, but they possessed a fatal flaw that would ultimately lead to their downfall. They were proud and stubborn, refusing to honor the gods or acknowledge their dependence on divine favor. They built magnificent cities and created works of art, but they failed to establish temples or offer sacrifices. In their arrogance, they believed that their own abilities were sufficient to ensure their prosperity and happiness. This impiety could not be tolerated in Zeus's new cosmic order. The king of the gods had established clear principles of divine justice, and respect for the immortals was fundamental to the proper functioning of the universe. After giving the Silver Age humans many warnings and opportunities to change their ways, Zeus finally decided that they must be removed from the earth. The Silver Age ended in a great catastrophe that wiped out this entire generation of humanity. Unlike their golden predecessors, who had been transformed into beneficial spirits, the Silver humans were condemned to wander the underworld as restless ghosts, forever separated from the light and warmth of the upper world. Their fate served as a warning to all future generations about the consequences of divine defiance. The third phase was the Bronze Age, which marked a dramatic shift in the nature of human existence. Zeus created this new race from ash trees, giving them bodies of incredible strength and endurance, but hearts filled with an insatiable love of war and violence. Bronze Age humans were giants compared to later mortals, capable of wielding massive weapons and wearing armor that would crush ordinary men beneath its weight. These bronze warriors spent their entire lives in conflict, fighting endless battles for the sheer joy of combat. They cared nothing for agriculture or craftsmanship, art or philosophy. Their only interests were weapons and warfare, strategy and conquest. They forged their tools and weapons from bronze, that gleaming metal that was harder than anything that had come before but would eventually be surpassed by iron. The Bronze Age humans built great fortresses and trained constantly for battle, but their violence was not directed only at external enemies. They turned their weapons against each other with equal enthusiasm, fighting brother against brother, city against city, in an endless cycle of conflict that gradually consumed their entire civilization. Their strength, which should have been their greatest asset, became the instrument of their destruction. Eventually, the Bronze Age warriors managed to destroy themselves through their own uncontrolled aggression. They died not through divine intervention, but through their own inability to control their violent impulses. Zeus did not need to punish them because they had become their own punishment. Unlike the previous races, they left no spirits or ghosts behind, simply vanishing from the earth as if they had never existed. But before the Bronze Age ended completely, something unprecedented occurred. Zeus looked down at the endless warfare consuming the earth and felt something that surprised even him, a kind of nostalgia for a different possibility. What if there could be a race of humans who combined the strength of the bronze warriors with the nobility of the golden race, who could fight when necessary, but also create beauty and meaning in their lives? This vision led to the creation of the fourth race, the Age of Heroes, which represented a brief return to divine favor after the disasters of the Bronze Age. The heroic age humans were not pure mortals like their predecessors, but were often the children of unions between gods and humans. This divine blood gave them abilities that far exceeded those of ordinary mortals, but also connected them more closely to the cosmic dramas of the immortal realm. The heroes of this age were larger than life in every sense. They possessed superhuman strength, courage, and intelligence, enabling them to undertake quests and adventures that would be impossible for later generations. They fought monsters that threatened civilization, rescued innocents from supernatural dangers, and served as champions of justice and divine order. These heroes founded great cities, established royal dynasties, and created the first true civilizations that combined military prowess with cultural achievement. They built temples to honor the gods, established laws to govern their societies, and created works of art and literature that would inspire all future generations. The heroic age represented the highest point of cooperation between mortal and divine realms. Many of the greatest heroes were directly related to the Olympian gods. Their divine parentage gave them access to supernatural abilities and divine guidance, but it also made them pawns in the complex political and emotional dramas of the immortal realm. They found themselves caught between their mortal limitations and their divine heritage, struggling to fulfill destinies that were often tragic despite their heroic nature. The heroic age produced the great cycles of stories that would define Greek mythology for all time. These were the tales of heroes who sailed across unknown seas, battled terrible monsters, fell in love with goddesses, and faced impossible choices between duty and desire. Their adventures took them to the edges of the known world and beyond, into realms where the boundaries between mortal and divine became blurred. But like all the previous ages, the heroic age was destined to end. The constant interference of the gods in mortal affairs, while it produced great adventures and mighty deeds, also created instability and conflict that ultimately proved unsustainable. The heroes themselves became too powerful, too independent, too willing to challenge divine authority when it conflicted with their own sense of justice. The end of the heroic age came not through a single catastrophe, but through a gradual process of divine withdrawal. The gods began to reduce their direct involvement in mortal affairs, allowing natural processes and human choice to play larger roles in determining the course of events. The age of direct divine intervention was drawing to a close, replaced by a more distant and complex relationship between heaven and earth. This transition marked the beginning of the fifth and final age, the Iron Age, in which the Greeks of Hesiod's time believed they were living. This was an age of hardship and struggle, where humans had to work hard for everything they achieved, where conflict and suffering were constant companions, where the gods seemed distant and often indifferent to mortal concerns. Iron Age humans were smaller and weaker than their heroic predecessors, with shorter lifespans and more limited abilities. They faced diseases and natural disasters, wars and famines, the constant threat of death, and the certainty of aging. Yet they also possessed something that previous generations had lacked, the ability to choose their own destinies without constant divine interference. The Iron Age was not simply a decline from previous glories, but represented a different kind of human potential. Without the overwhelming presence of divine power to guide or constrain them, humans had to develop their own wisdom, create their own meaning, and take responsibility for their own choices. This was both a burden and an opportunity, a chance for humanity to mature and discover its own distinctive nature. As the gods observed this final age of human development, they began to understand that their relationship with mortals was evolving into something new and unprecedented. The simple patterns of the past, where divine will directly shaped mortal destiny, were giving way to a more complex interaction where human choice and divine influence would have to find new ways to coexist. As the ages of humanity unfolded and the relationship between gods and mortals grew more complex, the world became populated with beings that defied easy categorization. These were the monsters, creatures born from the primordial forces of chaos and destruction that had never been fully tamed by the rise of cosmic order. They lurked at the edges of civilization, in dark caves and forbidden forests, in the depths of the sea and the shadows of the underworld, representing the wild, untamed aspects of existence that could never be completely controlled. The mother of many of these terrible beings was Echidna, a creature who was half beautiful woman and half serpent. She dwelt in a cave beneath the earth, far from the light of the sun and the civilized world above. Her husband was Typhon, the most fearsome monster ever born, a giant with 100 dragon heads whose eyes blazed with fire and whose voices could mimic any sound in creation. When Typhon roared, mountains trembled and the sea boiled with fear. From the union of Echidna and Typhon came a brood of monsters that would plague heroes and terrorize mortals for generations to come. There was the Hydra, a many-headed serpent whose breath was so poisonous that even its scent could kill, and whose heads would multiply whenever one was cut off. The Chimera emerged from their cave as well, a creature with the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and the tail of a serpent, breathing fire that could melt bronze and stone. Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades, also descended from this monstrous lineage. His duty was to guard the gates of the underworld, ensuring that the living could not enter the realm of the dead and that the dead could not return to trouble the living. His 3 heads could see in all directions at once, and his bite carried the venom of the underworld itself. Perhaps most terrible of all was the Sphinx, a creature with the head of a woman, the body of a lion, and the wings of an eagle. She possessed not only physical power but also a cunning intelligence that made her far more dangerous than mere brute force could ever be. The Sphinx delighted in riddles and wordplay, using her wit as a weapon more deadly than her claws. These monsters were not simply random threats to be overcome by brave heroes. They represented specific aspects of the human condition, fears and challenges that every person must face in their journey through life. The Hydra's multiplying heads symbolize the way that solving one problem often creates 2 more, the endless struggle against difficulties that seem to regenerate faster than they can be defeated. The Chimera's impossible combination of different animals represented the confusion and contradictions that exist within human nature itself. The gods themselves were not immune to the influence of these chaotic forces. Even Zeus, the king of the cosmos, found his rule challenged by beings that embodied the primal energies that had existed before order was imposed upon the universe. When Typhon emerged from the depths to challenge divine authority, the battle that followed shook the very foundations of creation. Typhon was so terrible that when he first appeared, most of the Olympian gods fled in terror, transforming themselves into animals to escape his wrath. Only Zeus stood firm, wielding his thunderbolts in a cosmic battle that raged across the heavens and the earth. The struggle was so violent that it nearly tore apart the careful order that had been established after the defeat of the Titans. Finally, Zeus managed to defeat Typhon by trapping him beneath Mount Etna in Sicily, where the monster's fiery breath still escapes as volcanic eruptions. This victory ensured that divine order would prevail, but it also demonstrated that chaos could never be completely eliminated from the universe. It could only be contained, held in check by constant vigilance and the exercise of divine power. The defeat of Typhon marked the beginning of a new phase in the relationship between gods and monsters. Rather than simply destroying these chaotic beings, the gods began to use them as tests and challenges for mortal heroes. The monsters became part of a cosmic educational system designed to teach humans about courage, wisdom, and the importance of divine favor in overcoming seemingly impossible obstacles. This was the context in which the great hero Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules, began his legendary career. Born from the union of Zeus and a mortal woman named Alcmene, Heracles possessed strength that surpassed all other mortals, but he also inherited the curse that seemed to follow all of Zeus's illegitimate children. Hera, the queen of the gods, viewed every such child as a reminder of her husband's infidelity and made it her mission to make their lives as difficult as possible. From the moment of his birth, Heracles was marked for a life of struggle and hardship. Hera sent serpents to kill him in his cradle, but the infant hero strangled them with his bare hands, displaying the supernatural strength that would define his existence. As he grew to manhood, Hera's persecution continued, driving him to fits of madness that led to terrible tragedies. The most devastating of these occurred when Heracles, in a fit of divine madness sent by Hera, killed his own wife and children. When he recovered his sanity and realized what he had done, his grief and guilt were so overwhelming that he sought purification and redemption through service to others. The oracle at Delphi commanded him to serve his cousin Eurystheus for 12 years, performing whatever labors the king might assign. These became the famous 12 labors of Heracles, each one designed to be impossible for any mortal to accomplish. Eurystheus, guided by Hera's malice, chose tasks that would bring Heracles into contact with the most dangerous monsters and the most challenging situations imaginable. The hero was commanded to slay the Nemean lion, whose golden hide was impervious to any weapon, and to defeat the Hydra of Lerna, whose poisonous breath could kill from a distance. He was ordered to capture the golden hind of Artemis, a deer so swift that it could outrun the wind itself, and to bring back alive the Erymanthian boar, a creature so fierce that even the sight of it struck terror into the hearts of brave warriors. Each labor required not only incredible physical strength but also intelligence, cunning, and the ability to find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The labors took Heracles to the edges of the known world and beyond. He descended into the underworld to capture Cerberus, the three-headed guardian of the dead, demonstrating that his courage extended even to the realm of Hades. He ventured to the far west to steal the cattle of Geryon, a three-bodied giant who lived beyond the pillars of Heracles at the edge of the ocean that encircled the world. Perhaps most significantly, he was commanded to obtain the golden apples of the Hesperides, fruits that grew in a garden at the world's end and were guarded by an immortal dragon. This task required him to seek the help of Atlas, the titan who held up the sky, and temporarily take on that cosmic burden himself while Atlas retrieved the apples. The image of Heracles bearing the weight of the heavens became one of the most powerful symbols in all of mythology, representing the idea that true heroism sometimes requires shouldering burdens that seem beyond human capacity. But the story of Heracles was not just about individual heroism overcoming monstrous challenges. It was also about the complex web of relationships and conflicts that connected gods, heroes, and mortals in an intricate pattern of cause and effect. Hera's persecution of Heracles created ripple effects that touched countless other lives, demonstrating how divine emotions and rivalries could have far-reaching consequences for innocent mortals. This pattern of divine interference in mortal affairs was even more dramatically illustrated in the cursed bloodlines that came to dominate some of the greatest tragic stories in Greek mythology. These were families that became trapped in cycles of violence and revenge, where the sins of one generation would inevitably be visited upon the next, creating tragic patterns that seemed impossible to break. The most famous of these cursed lineages was the House of Atreus, a royal family whose story encompassed some of the most horrifying crimes imaginable. The curse began with Tantalus, a king who was favored by the gods and invited to dine with them on Mount Olympus. But Tantalus committed an act so horrible that it defied comprehension. To test whether the gods were truly omniscient, he killed his own son Pelops and served the child's flesh to the immortals as food. The gods immediately recognized the nature of the meal and restored Pelops to life, but Tantalus was condemned to eternal punishment in the underworld. He was placed in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree, but whenever he tried to drink, the water would recede, and whenever he reached for the fruit, the branches would pull away from his grasp. His name gave us the word tantalize, representing the agony of being forever denied what seems within reach. But the curse did not end with Tantalus. His son Pelops, though restored to life by the gods, carried the taint of his father's crime into the next generation. Pelops won his bride Hippodamia through a chariot race, but only by bribing his opponent's charioteer to sabotage the race. When the charioteer demanded his promised reward, Pelops killed him instead, and the dying man cursed the entire line of Pelops with his final breath. This curse manifested most dramatically in the next generation, with the rivalry between Pelops' sons Atreus and Thyestes. Their competition for the throne of Mycenae led to a series of increasingly horrible crimes. When Thyestes seduced Atreus' wife, Atreus pretended to forgive him and invited him to a reconciliation feast. But the meal that Atreus served consisted of Thyestes' own children, killed and cooked by their uncle. When Thyestes realized what he had eaten, his curse upon the house of Atreus echoed through the generations. The pattern of cannibalism and familial murder that had begun with Tantalus repeated itself, demonstrating how violence begets violence and how the sins of the fathers are indeed visited upon their children. The curse continued into the next generation with Agamemnon and Menelaus, the sons of Atreus, whose involvement in the Trojan War would bring the family curse to its ultimate fulfillment. Agamemnon's sacrifice of his daughter Iphigenia to ensure favorable winds for the Greek fleet, and his wife Clytemnestra's subsequent murder of him upon his return from Troy, were all part of the inexorable working out of the family's tragic destiny. Another cursed bloodline that captured the Greek imagination was that of Oedipus, the king of Thebes whose story embodied the terrifying power of fate and the limits of human knowledge. Oedipus's tragedy began even before his birth with a prophecy that declared he would kill his father and marry his mother. His parents, King Laius and Queen Jocasta, tried to prevent this fate by abandoning the infant on a mountainside, but their efforts to escape destiny only ensured its fulfillment. Rescued and raised by shepherds, then adopted by the royal family of Corinth, Oedipus grew up believing himself to be the son of different parents entirely. When he consulted the oracle at Delphi about his true identity, he received only the terrible prophecy about killing his father and marrying his mother. Horrified by this prediction and determined to prevent it, Oedipus fled from Corinth, not knowing that he was actually running toward his biological parents and his destiny. On the road to Thebes, he encountered a stranger at a crossroads and killed him in a dispute over right of way. This stranger was Laius, his true father, making the first part of the prophecy come true without Oedipus having any knowledge of what he had done. He then arrived at Thebes, which was being terrorized by the Sphinx, and solved the famous riddle that had stumped all previous challengers. The Sphinx had asked what creature walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening. Oedipus answered correctly that it was man, who crawls as a baby, walks upright as an adult, and uses a cane in old age. Defeated by this correct answer, the Sphinx threw herself from a cliff, freeing Thebes from her reign of terror. As a reward for saving the city, Oedipus was made king and given the hand of the recently widowed queen Jocasta in marriage. For many years he ruled wisely and well, never suspecting that he had married his own mother and that their children were both his offspring and his siblings. The second part of the prophecy had been fulfilled as completely as the first. The truth was finally revealed years later when a plague struck Thebes and the oracle declared that it would not end until the murderer of Laius was found and punished. Oedipus, determined to save his city, launched an investigation that gradually uncovered the horrible truth about his own identity and actions. When Jocasta realized what had happened, she hanged herself in despair, and Oedipus gouged out his own eyes, declaring that since his sight had failed to show him the truth, he would no longer use it to see the world. These stories of cursed bloodlines and tragic destinies served a crucial function in Greek culture, providing a framework for understanding the relationship between individual choice and cosmic forces beyond human control. They explored the question of whether human beings are truly free to shape their own destinies, or whether they are bound by forces, whether divine, natural, or psychological, that predetermine the course of their lives. The monsters, prophecies, and curses that populated these stories were not simply external threats to be overcome by heroic action. They represented internal conflicts and moral dilemmas that every person must face. The monsters embodied the destructive impulses that lurk within human nature, the potential for violence and chaos that civilization works constantly to contain. The prophecies and curses represented the weight of the past and the consequences of choices that extend far beyond the immediate moment of decision. Through these myths, the Greeks explored some of the deepest questions about the nature of existence. What is the relationship between knowledge and wisdom? Can terrible crimes ever be truly forgiven or forgotten? How do we live with the knowledge that our actions may have consequences we never intended? These questions had no easy answers, but the myths provided a way to think about them that was both emotionally powerful and intellectually sophisticated. The gods themselves were not distant observers of these human struggles, but active participants in them, sometimes as helpers and sometimes as antagonists, but always as beings whose own natures were complex enough to encompass both creative and destructive impulses. The relationship between divine and mortal realms was revealed to be far more intricate and morally ambiguous than simple stories of good triumphing over evil could ever capture. Among all the cities that would rise to prominence in the ancient world, none would weave itself more intimately into the fabric of divine mythology than Athens. This city, destined to become the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, had its origins in a contest between gods that would establish patterns of divine rivalry and mortal achievement that echoed through all subsequent history. The story began with Zeus experiencing one of the most unusual events in his long reign as king of the gods. He had been suffering from terrible headaches that seemed to split his skull with pain. No remedy that the divine physicians could devise brought him any relief, until finally Hephaestus, the master craftsman among the gods, took his great hammer and struck Zeus directly on the forehead. From that crack in the divine skull emerged a fully grown goddess, already clothed in gleaming armor and carrying a spear and shield. This was Athena, born not from the union of male and female, but from the mind of Zeus himself. She represented a new kind of divinity, one that combined the traditional feminine roles of wisdom and craftsmanship with the masculine sphere of warfare and strategy. But her warfare was different from the brutal violence of Ares, the traditional god of battle. Athena's approach to conflict emphasized intelligence over brute force, strategy over mere aggression, defensive protection over offensive conquest. From the moment of her birth, Athena demonstrated the qualities that would make her one of the most revered deities in the Greek pantheon. She was wise without being cold, powerful without being cruel, innovative without being reckless. Her wisdom encompassed not only the abstract knowledge of philosophers but also the practical skills needed for civilization to flourish. She became the patron of craftsworkers and artisans, teaching mortals the arts of weaving, pottery, metalworking, and all the other skills that transformed raw materials into objects of beauty and utility. The contest that would determine her connection to Athens arose when the city was still young and in need of a divine protector. Both Athena and Poseidon, the great god of the seas, desired to become the patron deity of this promising settlement. The inhabitants, recognizing the honor and the practical benefits of divine patronage, declared that whichever god could provide the most valuable gift to the city would become its guardian and give the city its name. Poseidon, confident in his power over the fundamental forces of nature, struck the ground with his mighty trident. Immediately, a spring of water gushed forth from the earth, providing the city with a precious resource that was essential for any growing population. Water meant life, prosperity, and the ability to support a large community in a land where rainfall was often uncertain and rivers could run dry during the summer months. But when the people tasted the water that Poseidon had provided, they discovered that it was salt water, undrinkable and unsuitable for irrigation or any of the domestic purposes that fresh water could serve. The gift was powerful, but ultimately not as practical as it had first appeared. Poseidon had demonstrated his might, but he had not shown the kind of thoughtful consideration for human needs that would make him an ideal patron for a growing city. Athena approached the challenge differently. Instead of displaying raw power, she knelt and planted something small and seemingly insignificant in the earth. From her planting grew the first olive tree, its silvery green leaves shimmering in the Mediterranean sunlight. To the onlookers, this gift might have seemed modest compared to Poseidon's dramatic display, but as Athena explained the properties of her gift, its true value became apparent. The olive tree would provide food in the form of its nutritious fruit, oil for cooking and lighting lamps, wood for construction and fuel, and even leaves that could be used for medicinal purposes. Unlike Poseidon's spring, which provided one resource that proved to be flawed, Athena's olive tree offered multiple benefits that would continue to give value year after year, generation after generation. It was a gift that demonstrated not just power, but wisdom, foresight, and genuine care for the welfare of the people who would receive it. The citizens of the city voted, and Athena's practical wisdom won over Poseidon's impressive but ultimately limited display of force. The city was named Athens in her honor, and she became its patron goddess, establishing a relationship that would profoundly influence the character and destiny of both the city and the goddess herself. Poseidon, though disappointed by his defeat, eventually accepted the result and became a secondary patron of the city, particularly revered by sailors and those whose livelihoods depended on the sea. This founding myth established Athens as a city that would value intelligence over mere strength, practical wisdom over empty display, and careful planning over impulsive action. These characteristics would later manifest in Athens's development of democratic institutions, its emphasis on education and philosophy, and its approach to military strategy that relied on clever tactics rather than brute force alone. Under Athena's protection, Athens began to attract heroes and adventurers whose stories would become central to Greek mythology. The most famous of these was Theseus, a young prince whose journey to claim his inheritance would take him through some of the most dangerous territory in the ancient world and establish him as one of the greatest heroes of the age. Theseus was the son of Aegeus, the king of Athens, but he had been raised in the southern city of Trojan by his mother Aethra. His father had left tokens of his identity hidden beneath a great stone, declaring that when the boy was strong enough to lift the stone and retrieve these tokens, he would be ready to travel to Athens and claim his place as heir to the throne. When Theseus came of age and proved his strength by lifting the enormous stone, he found beneath it a sword and a pair of sandals that belonged to his father. He could have taken the safe sea route to Athens, but the young hero chose instead to travel by land, following the dangerous road that was infested with bandits and monsters who preyed upon travelers. This choice revealed something essential about Theseus's character. Like other great heroes of his generation, he was not content simply to reach his destination safely. He actively sought out challenges and dangers, seeing them as opportunities to prove his worth and to serve the greater good by removing threats that endangered innocent people. His journey to Athens became a series of heroic encounters that established his reputation long before he reached his father's city. The first of these encounters was with Periphetes, a bandit known as the Club Bearer, who wielded an enormous bronze club and used it to murder travelers for their possessions. Theseus not only defeated this criminal but took his club as a trophy, adding its power to his own natural strength. This began a pattern that would characterize many of Theseus's adventures, the transformation of weapons of evil into tools of justice. Next, he faced Sinis, called the Pine Bender, who had developed a particularly cruel method of execution. He would bend two pine trees toward each other, tie his victims between them, and then release the trees, tearing the poor travelers apart. Theseus turned this technique against its inventor, giving Sinis a taste of his own medicine and freeing the road from another predator who had made travel a nightmare for ordinary people. Perhaps most famously, Theseus encountered Procrustes, the innkeeper who offered hospitality to travelers but then forced them to fit his bed by either stretching them on a rack if they were too short or cutting off their legs if they were too tall. This story became a powerful metaphor for the dangers of forcing reality to conform to arbitrary standards, and Theseus's defeat of Procrustes represented the triumph of natural justice over artificial rules imposed by tyrants. By the time Theseus reached Athens, his fame had preceded him, and he was welcomed as a hero even before his true identity was revealed. King Aegeus recognized his son by the sword and sandals, and Theseus was acknowledged as the rightful heir to the throne. But his greatest adventure was yet to come, one that would forever link his name with Athens and establish him as the city's greatest hero. At this time, Athens was under the cruel domination of King Minos of Crete, who had defeated the Athenians in war and imposed a terrible tribute upon them. Every 7 years, Athens was required to send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete, where they would be fed to the Minotaur, a monster that was half man and half bull, and lived in an inescapable labyrinth beneath the palace of Minos. This tribute was both a practical demonstration of Cretan power over Athens and a religious sacrifice that honored the gods of Crete while humiliating their Athenian enemies. The young people chosen for this fate were selected by lot, making every family in Athens live in fear that their children might be chosen for this horrible destiny. When the time came for the 3rd tribute to be sent to Crete, Theseus volunteered to be one of the 7 young men, declaring his intention to kill the Minotaur and end the tribute forever. This decision horrified his father, who had only recently found his son and now faced the prospect of losing him to the most dangerous monster in the known world. But Theseus was determined to free his city from this burden, and no amount of pleading could dissuade him from his purpose. The ship that carried the tribute victims to Crete traditionally flew black sails, symbolizing the death that awaited the young Athenians. Theseus promised his father that if he succeeded in his mission, he would change the sails to white for the return journey, providing a signal that could be seen from far off that the Minotaur had been defeated and the tribute ended. When Theseus arrived in Crete, he faced a challenge that was more complex than simply defeating a monster in single combat. The Minotaur lived in a labyrinth designed by Daedalus, the greatest architect and inventor of the age. This maze was so cunningly constructed that anyone who entered it would become hopelessly lost, wandering its twisting passages until they either starved to death or were found and devoured by the creature that lurked at its heart. The labyrinth represented more than just a physical challenge. It was a symbol of the kind of complex, seemingly impossible problems that heroes must solve through a combination of courage, intelligence, and divine favor. No amount of brute strength could overcome the maze's design, and no conventional weapon could guarantee victory over a monster in its own domain. Theseus's solution came through the help of Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos, who fell in love with the young Athenian hero and decided to betray her father's interests to save Theseus's life. She consulted Daedalus himself, the creator of the labyrinth, who provided her with the simple but ingenious solution to the maze's challenge. Ariadne gave Theseus a ball of thread, instructing him to tie one end to the entrance of the labyrinth and unroll it as he made his way toward the center. This would provide him with a path back to safety after he had confronted the Minotaur, transforming the inescapable maze into a navigable challenge. The thread became known as Ariadne's clue, giving us the word we still use today for any piece of information that helps solve a mystery. Armed with this solution and his own courage, Theseus entered the labyrinth and made his way to its heart, where he found the Minotaur in its lair. The battle that followed was fierce and terrible, but Theseus's combination of strength, skill, and determination proved superior to the monster's brute power. He defeated the creature without weapons, using only his hands to strangle the beast that had terrorized two nations for so many years. Following Ariadne's thread back through the maze, Theseus emerged victorious and freed his fellow Athenians from their doom. He also liberated the young people from previous tributes who had survived their encounters with the Minotaur and were being held as slaves in the palace. The group escaped from Crete under cover of darkness, taking Ariadne with them as they sailed toward home and freedom. But the story of Theseus's return was marked by both triumph and tragedy. During the voyage home, the hero stopped at the island of Naxos, and there, for reasons that the ancient sources never fully explain, he abandoned Ariadne while she slept. Some versions of the story suggest that he was commanded to do so by the gods, others that he simply forgot her in his excitement to return home. Whatever the reason, this act of apparent ingratitude cast a shadow over his otherwise heroic achievement. The tragedy deepened when Theseus, in his eagerness to reach Athens and share the news of his victory, forgot to change the ship's sails from black to white. King Aegeus, watching from a cliff for his son's return, saw the black sails and assumed that Theseus had perished in his attempt to kill the Minotaur. Overcome with grief, the king threw himself into the sea, which thereafter bore his name as the Aegean Sea. Thus, Theseus's greatest triumph was also his greatest sorrow, and he inherited the throne of Athens under circumstances that would haunt him for the rest of his life. This pattern of mixed fortune, where heroic success comes at a personal cost, would become a recurring theme in Greek mythology, reflecting the complex moral reality of a world where even the greatest achievements often require painful sacrifices. As king of Athens, Theseus proved to be more than just a successful warrior. He became a wise ruler who transformed Athens from a collection of separate communities into a unified city-state, establishing many of the institutions and traditions that would later make Athens famous throughout the ancient world. He was credited with founding the Pantheon, the great festival that celebrated Athena and brought together all the people of Attica in a display of civic unity and religious devotion. The relationship between Theseus and Athena exemplified the special connection between the goddess of wisdom and the city that bore her name. She guided and protected him throughout his adventures, not through direct intervention, but through the gifts of intelligence and strategic thinking that allowed him to solve problems that pure strength could never overcome. In return, Theseus honored her with magnificent temples and festivals, establishing Athens as one of the most important centers of her worship. The story of the labyrinth and the Minotaur also introduced another figure who would become crucial to later mythological narratives. Daedalus, the creator of the maze, represented the power and the dangers of human ingenuity pushed to its limits. His architectural and engineering skills were so advanced that they seemed almost magical, capable of creating structures and devices that defied natural law. But Daedalus's brilliance came with a dark side. His creations, while magnificent, often served destructive purposes or had unintended consequences that caused suffering for innocent people. The labyrinth that housed the Minotaur was both a masterpiece of design and a tool of oppression. This duality would become even more apparent in later stories about Daedalus and his son Icarus, whose attempt to escape from Crete using artificial wings would become one of the most powerful cautionary tales about the dangers of overreaching human ambition. The rise of Athens and its heroes marked a new phase in the relationship between gods and mortals, one in which human intelligence and creativity began to play a larger role in shaping events. While divine favor remained important, heroes like Theseus succeeded primarily through their own cleverness and determination, using the gifts that the gods had given to humanity rather than relying on direct divine intervention. This shift reflected the growing complexity of Greek civilization itself, as city-states like Athens developed sophisticated political, cultural, and military institutions that required new kinds of leadership and new ways of thinking about the relationship between individual achievement and community welfare. The heroes of this age were not just mighty warriors, but also wise rulers, clever strategists, and innovative problem solvers who used their abilities to benefit their entire communities. The myths that grew up around Athens and its heroes served not just as entertainment, but as a kind of civic education, teaching citizens about the values and ideals that their city represented. Through stories like that of Theseus and the Minotaur, Athenians learned about the importance of courage in the face of seemingly impossible challenges, the value of intelligence over brute force, and the responsibility that comes with great power and privilege. As Athens grew in power and influence, its mythology became intertwined with the larger narrative of Greek civilization, setting the stage for the great conflicts and adventures that would define the heroic age. The city that Athena had chosen and Theseus had unified would soon find itself at the center of the most famous war in all of mythology, a conflict that would test every principle and value that its heroes had fought to establish. The greatest and most terrible war in all of mythology began not with armies clashing on a battlefield, but with a single golden apple and the wounded pride of a goddess who had been deliberately excluded from a wedding celebration. This was the war that would consume the greatest heroes of an entire generation, topple the mightiest city in the known world, and mark the beginning of the end of the age when gods and mortals walked the earth together as familiar companions. The seeds of this cosmic conflict were planted at the wedding of Peleus, a mortal hero, and Thetis, a sea goddess whose beauty had caught the attention of both Zeus and Poseidon. But a prophecy had revealed that any son born to Thetis would grow up to be greater than his father, a prediction that terrified the gods who remembered all too well the pattern of sons overthrowing their divine fathers. Rather than risk such a challenge to the cosmic order, Zeus decided that Thetis must marry a mortal, ensuring that her son would surpass only a human father, not a god. The wedding was a magnificent affair, with all the gods and goddesses invited to celebrate the union that would safeguard divine supremacy. All, that is, except for Eris, the goddess of discord and strife. This exclusion was not accidental but deliberate, for Eris had a talent for turning even the most joyful occasions into scenes of conflict and chaos. The other immortals hoped that by not inviting her, they could ensure that the wedding would proceed peacefully. But Eris was not one to accept such a slight quietly. She appeared at the wedding feast uninvited, carrying with her a golden apple inscribed with the words, "For the fairest." This simple fruit, crafted with divine malice, was designed to sow the seeds of vanity and competition among the goddesses present. When Eris rolled the apple onto the table and disappeared with a mocking laugh, it immediately caught the attention of three of the most powerful goddesses on Olympus. Hera, the queen of the gods, naturally assumed that the apple was meant for her. As Zeus's wife and the goddess of marriage, she held a position of supreme authority among the immortals that surely made her the most deserving of such a tribute. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare, believed that her combination of intelligence and power made her the obvious choice for the title of fairest. And Aphrodite, whose very essence was beauty and desire, felt that there could be no question about who should receive an apple dedicated to physical loveliness. The argument that erupted among these three goddesses threatened to tear apart the wedding celebration and, potentially, the stability of Olympus itself. Each goddess marshaled arguments for her own superiority, and each was absolutely convinced that she deserved the apple. Zeus, recognizing the dangerous potential of this conflict, wisely refused to judge between his wife, his daughter, and the goddess whose power over love affected even the immortals themselves. Instead, Zeus declared that the judgment should be made by a mortal, someone whose perspective might be more objective than that of the gods who were personally involved in the dispute. He chose Paris, a young prince of Troy who was renowned for his beauty and his supposedly fair judgment. Paris was at that time living as a shepherd on Mount Ida, having been exposed as an infant because of a prophecy that he would bring destruction to his city. Rescued and raised by shepherds, he had grown up ignorant of his royal heritage, but possessed of the wisdom and impartiality that comes from a simple life close to nature. When Hermes, the messenger god, brought the three goddesses to Paris and explained his task, the young shepherd found himself in an impossible position. He was being asked to choose between three immortal beings, each of whom possessed the power to bless or curse his entire life based on his decision. The very fact that they had come to him meant that the stakes of this judgment were far higher than the simple question of physical beauty. Recognizing the complexity of his situation, each goddess attempted to influence Paris's decision by offering him a bribe that reflected her own particular sphere of power. Hera, as the goddess of royal authority, promised to make him the ruler of all Asia, offering him political power that would make him one of the most important kings in the world. Athena offered him wisdom and victory in battle, the gifts that would make him a great warrior and a wise leader whose fame would echo through the ages. But it was Aphrodite's offer that proved most tempting to a young man who had spent his life in the isolation of the mountains. She promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, a prize that appealed not just to his desires but to his sense of what would make life most worth living. In a decision that would have consequences far beyond anything he could imagine, Paris awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to one of the most devastating wars in human history. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, the daughter of Zeus and Leda, who had been raised as a princess of Sparta. Her beauty was so extraordinary that it seemed almost supernatural, and suitors came from every corner of the Greek world seeking her hand in marriage. Her foster father, King Tyndareus of Sparta, realized that choosing one suitor over all the others would create dangerous enemies, so he devised a clever solution to protect both Helen and her eventual husband. Before announcing Helen's choice of husband, Tyndareus required all her suitors to swear a sacred oath that they would defend whoever she married against anyone who might try to take her away. This oath bound together all the greatest heroes and kings of Greece in a mutual defense pact that would have enormous consequences when Helen's marriage was later threatened. Helen chose Menelaus, the brother of Agamemnon and a prince of the powerful house of Atreus, as her husband. Their marriage was celebrated throughout Greece as the union of the most beautiful woman with one of the most powerful royal families, and for a time they lived happily in Sparta, ruling together and raising their daughter Hermione. But Aphrodite had not forgotten her promise to Paris. Years after the judgment on Mount Ida, she guided the Trojan prince to Sparta, where he was received as an honored guest by Menelaus and Helen. Paris had by this time discovered his true identity and returned to Troy, where he was welcomed back into the royal family despite the prophecy that had led to his abandonment. He had become a prince of one of the wealthiest and most powerful cities in the world, but he had not forgotten Aphrodite's promise of the most beautiful woman as his reward. The goddess of love worked her magic on both Paris and Helen, filling them with an irresistible passion for each other that overwhelmed all considerations of duty, honor, or consequences. When Menelaus was called away to Crete for the funeral of his grandfather, Paris and Helen fled together to Troy, taking with them a substantial portion of the Spartan royal treasury and leaving behind a note that would change the course of history. Menelaus's rage when he discovered his wife's betrayal and the theft of his treasure was matched only by his determination to retrieve both Helen and his honor. He immediately called upon his brother Agamemnon, the most powerful king in Greece, who in turn invoked the oath that all of Helen's former suitors had sworn. One by one, the heroes of Greece were reminded of their sacred promise to defend Helen's marriage, and reluctantly or eagerly, they began to gather their forces for war. Some came willingly, seeing the expedition as an opportunity for glory and plunder. Others tried to avoid their obligations through various stratagems. Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, pretended to be insane, plowing his fields with salt and sowing them with stones. But his deception was exposed when Palamedes placed Odysseus's infant son Telemachus in front of the plow, forcing the supposed madman to reveal his sanity by swerving to avoid harming his child. Achilles, the greatest warrior of his generation, was hidden by his mother Thetis among the daughters of King Lycomedes, disguised as a girl to prevent him from joining the expedition. Thetis knew from prophecy that if Achilles went to Troy, he would win eternal glory but die young, while if he stayed home, he would live a long but unremarkable life. But Odysseus discovered Achilles by spreading weapons among feminine trinkets and observing which of the supposed girls immediately gravitated toward the tools of war. The assembly of the Greek fleet at the port of Aulis became one of the largest military gatherings the world had ever seen. Over 1,000 ships carrying more than 100,000 warriors represented virtually every kingdom and city-state in Greece. The catalogue of these forces reads like a roll call of legendary heroes. Agamemnon leading the Mycenaeans, Ajax the Greater from Salamis, Ajax the Lesser from Locris, Diomedes from Argos, Nestor the wise counselor from Pylos, and many others whose names would become immortal through their deeds in the coming war. But the expedition faced an immediate crisis when the winds died completely, leaving the fleet stranded in the harbor, unable to sail to Troy. The seer Calchas revealed that Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt, had been offended by Agamemnon's boast that he was a better hunter than she was. The goddess demanded a terrible price for her forgiveness. Agamemnon must sacrifice his own daughter Iphigenia to appease her wrath and restore the winds. This demand placed Agamemnon in an agonizing position that illustrated the cruel dilemmas that the gods sometimes imposed upon mortals. As the leader of the expedition, he was responsible for the welfare of the entire army and the success of a war that had become a matter of honor for all of Greece. But as a father, the thought of killing his own child was almost unbearable. The decision he finally made would haunt him for the rest of his life and ultimately lead to his own destruction. Agamemnon sent word to his wife Clytemnestra that she should bring Iphigenia to Aulis, claiming that the girl was to be married to Achilles as a reward for the hero's participation in the war. When mother and daughter arrived and discovered the true purpose of their journey, Clytemnestra's pleas and Iphigenia's terror could not move Agamemnon from his course. He had chosen duty over family, the needs of the many over the life of the one, and he carried out the sacrifice with his own hands. The winds returned immediately, and the fleet set sail for Troy, but the consequences of this act would echo through the remaining years of the war and beyond. Clytemnestra's grief and rage at her husband's betrayal would ultimately lead her to murder him upon his return from Troy, continuing the cycle of violence that had plagued the house of Atreus for generations. The war that followed the arrival of the Greeks at Troy lasted for 10 long years, becoming a grinding siege that tested the endurance and resolve of both sides. The city of Troy, also known as Ilium, was one of the most powerfully fortified settlements in the ancient world, built on a hill overlooking the strategic strait that connected Europe and Asia. Its walls were said to have been built by the gods themselves, making it virtually impregnable to direct assault. The conflict that developed was unlike any previous war, not simply because of its scale and duration, but because of the direct involvement of the gods themselves. The immortals chose sides in this mortal conflict, with some supporting the Greeks and others favoring the Trojans. This divine participation transformed what might have been a straightforward siege into a cosmic drama where mortal heroism became entangled with immortal politics and passions. Aphrodite naturally supported the Trojans, since it was her promise to Paris that had started the war. She was joined by Apollo, who had long been a patron of Troy, and by Ares, the god of war, who reveled in the bloodshed regardless of which side emerged victorious. On the Greek side stood Hera, whose hatred of Paris for not choosing her in the beauty contest had grown into a determination to see Troy destroyed. Athena also supported the Greeks, both from her own resentment over the judgment of Paris and from her role as patron of heroic warfare. Poseidon's allegiance was more complicated. He had helped build the walls of Troy but had been cheated of his promised payment by the Trojan king Laomedon, Paris's grandfather. This old grievance inclined him to support the Greeks, but his loyalties shifted throughout the war depending on the immediate circumstances and his complex relationships with other gods. Zeus himself attempted to remain neutral, but this proved increasingly difficult as the war continued and the other gods became more deeply involved. His position was complicated by the fact that he had sons fighting on both sides. Sarpedon, a Lycian ally of Troy, and various Greek heroes who could claim divine parentage. The king of the gods found himself torn between his desire to maintain cosmic order and his emotional investment in the fates of individual mortals. The most famous episodes of the war centered around Achilles, the son of Peleus and Thetis, whose divine heritage made him the mightiest warrior of his generation. Achilles embodied both the glory and the tragedy of the heroic ideal. His prowess in battle was unmatched, his courage was absolute, and his loyalty to his comrades was fierce. But he also possessed a pride and a capacity for rage that could be both inspiring and destructive. The crisis that defined Achilles' role in the war arose from a quarrel with Agamemnon over a captive woman named Briseis. When a plague sent by Apollo forced Agamemnon to return his own captive, Chryseis, to her father, the king demanded Briseis as compensation, asserting his authority as commander of the expedition. This public humiliation enraged Achilles, who withdrew from the fighting and persuaded his mother Thetis to ask Zeus to grant victory to the Trojans until the Greeks acknowledged his worth. Achilles' withdrawal from battle had catastrophic consequences for the Greek army. Without their greatest champion, they found themselves steadily pushed back toward their ships by the rejuvenated Trojan forces led by Hector, the eldest son of King Priam and the greatest of the Trojan heroes. Hector was everything that a hero should be: brave without being reckless, strong without being cruel, loyal to his family and his city, without being blind to the costs of war. The contrast between Achilles and Hector represented two different models of heroism. Achilles was the warrior as force of nature, powerful and terrible and ultimately tragic, driven by emotions so intense that they could reshape the world around him. Hector was the warrior as protector and defender, fighting not for personal glory, but for the safety of his wife Andromache, his infant son Astyanax, and all the people of Troy who depended on him for their survival. As the Trojans pressed their advantage and threatened to burn the Greek ships, Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion, begged to be allowed to enter the battle wearing Achilles' armor. The sight of what appeared to be Achilles returning to the fight rallied the Greeks and drove back the Trojans, but Patroclus, intoxicated by his success, pushed too far forward and was killed by Hector in single combat. The death of Patroclus transformed Achilles' anger from a political grievance into a personal obsession with revenge that consumed every other consideration. His grief and rage were so intense that they frightened even the gods, and when he finally returned to battle, he fought with a fury that seemed to transcend mortal limitations. Armed with new divine armor forged by Hephaestus, Achilles carved a path of destruction through the Trojan ranks, seeking only his confrontation with Hector. The final duel between Achilles and Hector became the climactic moment of the entire war, a confrontation that represented not just personal vengeance but the collision of two different visions of what it meant to be a hero. Hector knew that he was likely to die in this battle, but he could not avoid it without dishonoring himself and abandoning his duty to his city. Achilles was driven by a grief so profound that he no longer cared about his own survival, wanting only to make Hector pay for Patroclus's death. When the two warriors finally met outside the walls of Troy, with the entire city watching from the battlements and the Greek army arrayed in the distance, the outcome was never really in doubt. Achilles was the greater warrior, favored by the gods and driven by an intensity of purpose that made him unstoppable. He killed Hector in single combat, but his treatment of the body afterward revealed how completely his humanity had been consumed by his need for revenge. Rather than allowing Hector's body to be returned to his family for proper burial, Achilles tied it to his chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy, defiling the corpse of a fallen enemy in a way that violated all the codes of honor that supposedly governed heroic warfare. For 12 days he continued this desecration, until finally the gods themselves intervened, and old King Priam was guided by divine protection to Achilles' tent to ransom his son's body. The meeting between Priam and Achilles became one of the most emotionally powerful scenes in all of literature, as the old king's grief for his son awakened Achilles' own sorrow for Patroclus and reminded him of his father's eventual grief for his own death. In this moment of shared humanity, the cycle of revenge was temporarily broken, and Hector's body was returned for the funeral honors that every hero deserved. But the war was far from over, and Achilles' own destiny was rapidly approaching. Soon after Hector's death, Achilles himself was killed by Paris, guided by Apollo, with an arrow that struck his one vulnerable spot, his heel. His mother Thetis had made him invulnerable by dipping him in the river Styx, but she had held him by the heel, leaving that one point unprotected. The phrase Achilles' heel would become a permanent part of human language, representing the fatal flaw that can bring down even the mightiest hero. The death of Achilles marked the beginning of the end for the Trojan War, but the final victory would come not through military prowess but through cunning and deception. Odysseus, the most clever of the Greek heroes, devised the stratagem that would finally breach Troy's impregnable walls. The famous wooden horse that appeared to be a gift from the departing Greeks but actually concealed a small force of warriors in its hollow belly. The fall of Troy was swift and terrible once the hidden warriors emerged to open the city gates for their returning comrades. The sack of the city was marked by scenes of violence and tragedy that stained the Greek victory with moral ambiguity. The wholesale slaughter of civilians, the enslavement of the women and children, and the desecration of temples offended the gods and ensured that the Greek victory would come with a heavy price in divine retribution. The Trojan War had begun with the wounded pride of a goddess excluded from a wedding feast, but it ended with the complete destruction of one of the greatest cities in the world and the death or displacement of most of the heroes who had participated in it. The Age of Heroes was drawing to a close, and the relationship between gods and mortals would never again be as intimate or as dramatic as it had been during these 10 years of cosmic conflict. The fall of Troy marked not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a new kind of suffering that would plague the victorious Greeks for years to come. The gods, who had been so deeply involved in the conflict itself, were horrified by the brutality that accompanied the city's destruction. The wholesale slaughter of civilians, the violation of temples, and the enslavement of innocent women and children had offended divine sensibilities and violated the sacred laws that were supposed to govern even the conduct of war. The sack of Troy revealed something troubling about the heroes who had fought so valiantly for 10 years. In their moment of triumph, many of them abandoned the codes of honor and respect for the gods that had previously defined heroic behavior. Ajax the Lesser dragged the priestess Cassandra from Athena's temple where she had sought sanctuary, violating both the law of sanctuary and the sanctity of the goddess's shrine. Neoptolemus, the young son of Achilles, murdered the aged king Priam at the altar of Zeus, showing no mercy for the helpless old man who had once moved his father to pity. These acts of sacrilege and brutality demanded divine punishment, and the gods responded by making the journey home as difficult and dangerous as the war itself had been. The Greek word for these return journeys was nostoi, and the stories that grew up around them became some of the most compelling and psychologically complex tales in all of mythology. The heroes who had conquered the greatest city in the world found themselves lost, cursed, and scattered across the Mediterranean, learning that victory in war did not guarantee a safe return to the lives they had left behind. The most famous of these return journeys was that of Odysseus, whose 10-year voyage home to Ithaca became the subject of Homer's Odyssey, one of the greatest adventure stories ever told. Odysseus had been one of the cleverest and most resourceful of the Greek heroes, the inventor of the wooden horse stratagem that had finally brought down Troy. But his journey home would test not just his intelligence and courage, but his fundamental understanding of what it meant to be human in a world governed by forces beyond mortal control. The curse that plagued Odysseus began almost immediately after he left Troy. His first stop was at the land of the Cicones, where he and his men sacked the city of Ismarus in an act of casual piracy that revealed how the long years of war had coarsened their moral sensibilities. This unprovoked attack brought swift retribution from the Cicones allies, and Odysseus lost many of his men in the battle that followed. Driven from the Cicones land by fierce storms, Odysseus and his remaining ships were blown far off course to the land of the Lotus Eaters, where some of his crew consumed the magical fruit that made them forget their homes and families, caring only to remain in that place of dreamy contentment forever. This was Odysseus's first encounter with the supernatural forces that would dominate his journey, and it taught him that the greatest dangers often came not from obvious threats, but from temptations that seemed harmless or even pleasant. The pattern of Odysseus's adventures combined elements of traditional folk tales with profound psychological insights about the nature of temptation, identity, and the price of knowledge. Each encounter tested a different aspect of his character and revealed something important about the human condition. When he and his men became trapped in the cave of the Cyclops Polyphemus, Odysseus had to use his wits to devise an escape plan that involved blinding the giant and hiding under the bellies of sheep to avoid detection. But Odysseus's fatal flaw was his pride, his need to be recognized and remembered for his cleverness. As he sailed away from the Cyclops' island, safely beyond reach of the monster's strength, he could not resist calling out his real name and boasting about his trick. This moment of vanity gave Polyphemus the information he needed to call upon his father Poseidon for vengeance, and the sea god's curse would plague Odysseus for the remainder of his journey. The intervention of Poseidon transformed what might have been a difficult but manageable voyage into an epic trial that tested every aspect of Odysseus's character. The god of the seas used his power over wind and wave to drive the hero far from his intended course, forcing him into encounters with beings and forces that existed at the very edges of the known world. These adventures took Odysseus beyond the realm of ordinary human experience into a mythical landscape where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. On the island of Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, Odysseus received a gift that should have guaranteed his safe return home. Aeolus gave him a leather bag containing all the adverse winds, leaving only the favorable breezes free to carry his ships back to Ithaca. But when his homeland was actually in sight, Odysseus's curious crew opened the bag while he slept, thinking it contained treasure. The released winds drove them back across the sea, farther from home than ever before. This episode illustrated one of the central themes of Odysseus's journey, the way that human weaknesses and failures of trust could undo even the most generous divine assistance. The gods were willing to help mortals who proved themselves worthy, but they could not overcome the fundamental flaws in human nature that led people to make poor choices even when better options were available. The encounter with the Laestrygonians, a tribe of savage giants who destroyed all but one of Odysseus's ships and devoured most of his men, marked the point at which his journey became truly desperate. Reduced to a single vessel with a handful of survivors, Odysseus found himself in the realm of Circe, a powerful sorceress who had the ability to transform men into animals that reflected their true natures. When Odysseus's men first encountered Circe, she turned them into pigs, revealing perhaps their tendency toward gluttony and sensuality. But Odysseus himself proved immune to her magic, protected by a divine herb called moly that Hermes had given him. This immunity allowed him to overcome Circe and force her to restore his men to human form, but it also led to a year-long stay on her island that was both pleasant and dangerous. Circe became both ally and temptress to Odysseus, offering him comfort and pleasure that could easily have made him forget his mission to return home. She also provided him with crucial information about the challenges that lay ahead, including the necessity of visiting the underworld to consult the spirit of the prophet Tiresias about his future. This journey to the land of the dead became one of the most haunting episodes in all of literature, as Odysseus encountered the shades of fallen comrades and learned about the fates that awaited him and his family. In the underworld, Odysseus met the spirit of Achilles, who told him that he would rather be a living slave than a dead hero, challenging the entire value system that had driven the Trojan War. He also encountered the spirit of his own mother, who had died of grief during his long absence, and learned about the chaos that was consuming his household as suitors competed for his wife's hand and devoured his wealth. The knowledge that Odysseus gained in the underworld was both enlightening and burdensome. He learned that he would eventually reach home, but only after losing all his remaining companions, and that even then his trials would not be over. The gods had decreed that he must undertake one final journey, carrying an oar inland until he found people who had never seen the sea, and there make a sacrifice to Poseidon to finally end the god's anger. The remainder of Odysseus's voyage home was a series of encounters with supernatural forces that tested his ability to resist temptation and maintain his focus on his ultimate goal. The sirens, whose beautiful song lured sailors to their deaths, represented the danger of knowledge pursued for its own sake rather than for practical purposes. Odysseus satisfied his curiosity about their song by having himself tied to his ship's mast while his crew, their ears stopped with wax, rowed past the deadly island. The passage between Scylla and Charybdis forced Odysseus to choose between two equally terrible fates: the six-headed monster who would devour 6 of his men, or the whirlpool that would destroy his entire ship. His decision to face Scylla rather than risk total destruction illustrated the kind of tragic choice that leaders sometimes must make, accepting lesser evils to avoid greater disasters. The final test came on the island of the sun god Helios, where Odysseus's starving men, despite his warnings and their own oaths, slaughtered the sacred cattle of the sun. This act of desperation and sacrilege brought down the final divine punishment, and Zeus destroyed Odysseus's ship with a thunderbolt, leaving him as the sole survivor to wash ashore on the island of the nymph Calypso. Calypso's island represented the ultimate test of Odysseus's commitment to his human identity and mortal relationships. The beautiful nymph offered him immortality and eternal youth if he would remain with her as her husband, abandoning his mortal life and his aging wife Penelope. For 7 years, Odysseus was held on this island, torn between the genuine affection he felt for Calypso and his deeper longing for home and family. The resolution of this dilemma came only through divine intervention, when Athena finally persuaded Zeus to order Calypso to release Odysseus. The hero's choice to reject immortality in favor of returning to his mortal life represented a fundamental affirmation of human values over divine ones, suggesting that meaning came not from escaping the human condition but from embracing it fully with all its limitations and sorrows. When Odysseus finally reached Ithaca after 20 years of absence, he found his home overrun by suitors who were competing for Penelope's hand and consuming his wealth. His wife had remained faithful through all the years of his absence, using her own cleverness to delay choosing a new husband by weaving a shroud by day and unraveling it by night. But she could not hold off the suitors forever, and the situation had reached a crisis point. The recognition scene between Odysseus and Penelope became one of the most psychologically complex passages in ancient literature. After so many years of separation, and after all the adventures and temptations that had tested his loyalty, both husband and wife had to rediscover who they were in relation to each other. Penelope's caution in accepting the stranger's claim to be her husband reflected not just practical prudence but an understanding that the man who returned might be fundamentally changed by his experiences. The slaughter of the suitors that followed Odysseus's return was both a restoration of justice and a final act of violence that raised troubling questions about the hero's character. While the suitors had certainly abused the laws of hospitality and deserved punishment, the wholesale massacre that Odysseus orchestrated with the help of his son Telemachus and a few loyal servants was brutal even by the standards of the heroic age. The story of Odysseus's return thus ended on an ambiguous note that reflected the complex moral landscape of the post-war world. The hero had achieved his goal of returning home and had been reunited with his family, but the cost in violence and suffering had been enormous. The gods had tested him and found him worthy, but they had also revealed the darker aspects of his nature and the price that such testing exacted from both the hero and those around him. While Odysseus was struggling to return to Ithaca, other Greek heroes were experiencing their own difficult homecomings. Agamemnon, the leader of the expedition, met his death almost immediately upon his return to Mycenae. His wife Clytemnestra, who had never forgiven him for the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia, murdered him in his bath with the help of her lover Aegisthus. This act completed the cycle of violence that had plagued the house of Atreus for generations, but it also set up the next round of revenge when Agamemnon's son Orestes would eventually kill his mother to avenge his father. Menelaus, whose wife's abduction had started the entire war, had a somewhat happier fate, though his journey home was also marked by divine trials and supernatural encounters. He and Helen were reconciled and eventually reached Sparta, where they resumed their reign as king and queen. But their relationship bore the scars of all that had happened, and the Helen who returned was not the same innocent beauty who had fled with Paris years before. Some of the heroes never made it home at all. Ajax the Greater, who had been denied the armor of Achilles after the hero's death, committed suicide in a fit of madness and rage. Ajax the Lesser was shipwrecked and drowned as punishment for his sacrilege in Athena's temple. Many others simply disappeared during the chaotic years that followed the war, their fates unknown and their stories untold. The scattered returns of the Greek heroes marked the end of an era in the relationship between gods and mortals, the age when divine beings regularly intervened in human affairs, when heroes could expect to receive supernatural aid and guidance, was drawing to a close. The gods were beginning to withdraw from direct involvement in mortal affairs, leaving humans to find their own way in a world that was becoming more complex and morally ambiguous. And this transition was perhaps most clearly visible in the story of Aeneas, a Trojan hero who escaped the destruction of his city and eventually founded a new homeland in Italy. Aeneas's journey, as told by the Roman poet Virgil centuries later, represented a different kind of heroism than that displayed by the Greek warriors. Where Achilles had been driven by personal honor and Odysseus by cleverness and determination, Aeneas was motivated by duty to his family, his gods, and his destiny. The contrast between the Greek and Roman approaches to heroism reflected changing attitudes about the relationship between individual achievement and community responsibility. The Greek heroes of the Trojan War era were larger-than-life individuals whose personal qualities, both positive and negative, dominated their stories. Aeneas, by contrast, was a hero whose individual desires were subordinated to his obligations to establish a new Troy that would eventually become the Roman Empire. This shift in heroic ideals paralleled a broader change in the way people understood the role of the gods in human affairs. The capricious, passionate deities who had fought alongside mortals at Troy were gradually being replaced by more distant, abstract concepts of divine justice and cosmic order. The personal relationships between specific gods and individual heroes were giving way to more impersonal systems of law and fate that governed human behavior according to universal principles rather than divine favoritism. The wanderings that followed the Trojan War thus represented not just the difficult homecomings of individual heroes, but the end of an entire mythological age. The time when gods and mortals could interact as friends, enemies, lovers, and rivals was ending, replaced by a more mature but also more distant relationship between human and divine realms. The stories of Odysseus and his fellow wanderers captured this transition, showing heroes who had to rely increasingly on their own resources and moral judgments rather than on divine intervention to navigate the challenges of their lives. As these tales of return and reconciliation reached their conclusions, the stage was set for a new phase in the development of human civilization. The mythic time when anything seemed possible, when heroes could journey to the underworld and return, when gods regularly appeared to mortals in dreams and visions, was giving way to a more rational and ordered world where human institutions and human wisdom would play increasingly important roles in shaping the course of events. As the age of heroes drew to a close and the gods retreated into a more distant relationship with mortal affairs, a new kind of wisdom began to emerge among the Greeks. This was the wisdom of philosophy, a way of thinking that sought to understand the world through reason and observation rather than through divine revelation or mythological narrative. The transition from mythic to rational thinking was not sudden or complete, but it marked a fundamental shift in how human beings understood their place in the cosmos and their relationship to the forces that governed their lives. The first philosophers were not enemies of mythology, but rather thoughtful critics who recognized both the power and the limitations of mythological thinking. They understood that the ancient stories contained profound truths about human nature and the workings of the universe, but they also saw that these truths were often obscured by the anthropomorphic portrayal of the gods and the apparently arbitrary nature of divine behavior. Rather than simply rejecting the myths, these early thinkers began to reinterpret them, seeking to extract their essential wisdom while discarding the elements that seemed inconsistent with rational understanding. Xenophanes of Colophon, who lived in the 6th century before the Common Era, was among the first to articulate a systematic critique of traditional mythology. He observed that different peoples created gods who resembled themselves, noting that the Ethiopians depicted their deities as dark-skinned and flat-nosed, while the Thracians imagined theirs as fair-haired and blue-eyed. If horses could draw, he suggested with gentle irony, they would undoubtedly portray their gods as horses. This insight led Xenophanes to question the fundamental assumption that underlay most mythological thinking, the idea that the gods were essentially human beings with supernatural powers. Instead, he proposed that the divine was a single, unchanging, eternal principle that governed the universe through natural law rather than through personal intervention. This god did not resemble human beings in form or behavior, but was pure intelligence, moving all things through the power of mind alone. The implications of this philosophical revolution were enormous. If the gods were not anthropomorphic beings subject to human emotions and desires, then the traditional stories about their loves, rivalries, and interventions in mortal affairs could not be literally true. This did not necessarily mean that the myths were worthless, but it did suggest that their value lay in something other than their historical accuracy or their portrayal of actual divine behavior. Heraclitus of Ephesus, who was roughly contemporary with Xenophanes, developed a different but equally revolutionary approach to understanding the relationship between myth and truth. He argued that the universe was governed by a principle he called the Logos, a kind of divine reason that manifested itself through constant change and the tension between opposing forces. Fire was the fundamental element, he claimed, and everything in existence was part of an eternal process of transformation in which apparent opposites were revealed to be aspects of a single underlying unity. For Heraclitus, the myths were not false but rather encoded truths that required careful interpretation to be properly understood. The stories of divine conflicts and reconciliations, the cycles of creation and destruction, the complex relationships between order and chaos, all reflected the fundamental nature of reality as a dynamic process rather than a static condition. The wise person learned to see beyond the surface narrative to the deeper patterns that the myths revealed. This allegorical approach to mythology became increasingly sophisticated as Greek philosophy developed. Plato, the great philosopher of the 4th century, offered the most systematic critique of traditional mythology while also demonstrating how mythical thinking could be transformed rather than simply abandoned. In his Republic, Plato argued that the traditional myths were inappropriate for educating the young because they portrayed the gods as deceitful, violent, and morally inconsistent. But Plato did not reject mythological thinking entirely. Instead, he created his own myths, philosophical allegories that used storytelling techniques to convey abstract truths about reality, knowledge, and the human condition. The famous allegory of the cave, in which prisoners mistake shadows on a wall for reality itself, functioned exactly like a traditional myth, using concrete imagery and narrative structure to communicate insights that were difficult to express in purely logical terms. Plato's approach revealed something important about the relationship between mythical and rational thinking. Rather than being opposites, they were complementary ways of understanding reality, each with its own strengths and limitations. Rational analysis was superior for understanding the physical world and the logical relationships between ideas, but mythical thinking remained essential for grappling with questions of meaning, value, and ultimate purpose that could not be reduced to purely logical formulations. This recognition led to the development of increasingly sophisticated allegorical interpretations of the traditional myths. The Stoic philosophers, who emerged in the 3rd century before the Common Era, became particularly skilled at reading mythological narratives as encoded teachings about physics, ethics, and human psychology. They interpreted Zeus as the divine reason that governed the universe, Hera as the air that surrounded the earth, Poseidon as the moisture that permeated all things, and Hades as the force of dissolution that returned all compound things to their elemental components. The Stoics also developed psychological interpretations of the myths that were remarkably sophisticated in their understanding of human motivation and behavior. They saw the story of Pandora's box as an allegory for the way that human curiosity and desire led to suffering, but also recognized that hope remained as a divine gift that enabled people to endure even the worst circumstances. The labors of Heracles became a model for the philosophical life, showing how rational self-discipline could overcome the irrational passions symbolized by the various monsters the hero defeated. Even more radical was the approach developed by Euhemerus of Messene, who proposed that the gods had originally been great human rulers whose achievements had been exaggerated over time until they were remembered as supernatural beings. This theory, known as euhemerism, suggested that mythology was essentially distorted history, and that the truth about the past could be recovered by stripping away the supernatural elements and looking for the human events that lay beneath them. According to this interpretation, Zeus had been a powerful king who had conquered his enemies and established a great empire, but later generations had transformed him into the ruler of the heavens. Heracles had been a real hero whose strength and courage had enabled him to accomplish extraordinary deeds, but storytellers had eventually credited him with supernatural powers and impossible achievements. The Trojan War had actually occurred, but the involvement of gods and goddesses was a later addition that reflected the tendency of oral tradition to embellish historical events with supernatural elements. Euhemerism appealed to rational minds because it preserved the possibility that the myths contained historical truth while explaining away the supernatural elements that seemed inconsistent with natural law. It also provided a way for people to honor their cultural heritage without having to believe in the literal existence of anthropomorphic deities. The theory had enormous influence throughout the ancient world and would later be adopted by early Christian thinkers who used it to argue that pagan gods were actually human beings who had been falsely worshipped after their deaths. However, the allegorical and rationalistic approaches to mythology, while intellectually satisfying to philosophers and educated elites, could not completely replace the emotional and spiritual functions that the traditional myths had served. The stories of gods and heroes had provided not just explanations for natural phenomena, but also frameworks for understanding moral obligation, models for heroic behavior, and sources of comfort in times of crisis. Pure rational analysis, no matter how sophisticated, could not fully satisfy these deeper human needs. This recognition led to the development of mystery religions that attempted to combine philosophical insights with mythological narratives in ways that could provide both intellectual coherence and emotional satisfaction. The Eleusinian mysteries, which centered around the story of Demeter and Persephone, offered initiates a symbolic death and rebirth that promised both understanding of cosmic truths and assurance of personal immortality. The Dionysian mysteries used the myth of the gods' death and resurrection to create ecstatic experiences that transcended the boundaries between human and divine consciousness. These mystery cults represented a sophisticated synthesis of mythological and philosophical thinking that recognized the importance of both rational understanding and emotional experience in human life. They preserved the power of mythological imagery while incorporating philosophical insights about the nature of reality and the human soul. The rituals and teachings of these cults were secret, but their influence on later religious and philosophical development was enormous. The mystery religions also demonstrated how mythology could evolve and adapt to changing cultural circumstances without losing its essential power to shape human behavior and understanding. The myths of Demeter and Dionysus were ancient stories that had been told for centuries, but they were reinterpreted in ways that spoke to the spiritual needs of people living in an increasingly rational and cosmopolitan world. This process of reinterpretation and adaptation continued throughout the Hellenistic period as Greek culture spread throughout the Mediterranean world and came into contact with other mythological traditions. The Greeks proved remarkably adept at identifying connections between their own gods and the deities of other cultures, creating synthetic mythologies that preserved local traditions while incorporating them into broader cosmological frameworks. The Romans, who inherited and transformed Greek mythology, demonstrated how mythological thinking could be adapted to serve the needs of a different kind of society. Roman mythology emphasized duty, order, and collective achievement rather than individual heroism and personal honor. The gods became symbols of state power and social stability rather than models of passionate, unpredictable behavior. Aeneas replaced Achilles as the archetypal hero, representing pietas, or dutiful devotion to family, gods, and country, rather than personal glory achieved through martial prowess. The transformation of Greek mythology by Roman culture illustrated an important principle about the nature of mythological thinking. Myths are not fixed entities with unchanging meanings, but rather flexible symbolic systems that can be adapted to express the values and concerns of different times and places. The same basic stories could be interpreted in radically different ways depending on the cultural context in which they were told and the purposes they were intended to serve. This flexibility helped ensure the survival of mythological thinking even as rational philosophy became increasingly dominant in educated circles. Rather than being replaced by philosophy, mythology was transformed by it, becoming more self-conscious about its symbolic nature and more sophisticated in its methods of conveying meaning. The result was a tradition of allegorical interpretation that would profoundly influence later developments in literature, art, and religious thinking. The Neoplatonist philosophers of the later Roman Empire developed perhaps the most elaborate system of mythological interpretation, reading the ancient stories as complex allegories for the soul's journey from divine unity through material existence and back to spiritual reunion with the One. For thinkers like Plotinus and Proclus, every detail of the mythological narratives had profound metaphysical significance, and the proper interpretation of these stories required not just intellectual analysis, but spiritual purification and mystical insight. This tradition of philosophical mythology had enormous influence on the development of Christian thought, as early church fathers like Clement of Alexandria and Origen adapted allegorical methods developed for interpreting pagan myths to the interpretation of biblical narratives. The techniques that had been used to find philosophical truths in the stories of Zeus and Athena were applied to the stories of Moses and Christ, creating sophisticated theological systems that combined rational analysis with symbolic interpretation. The influence of Greek mythological thinking also extended into the realm of natural philosophy, where mythological imagery provided powerful metaphors for understanding physical processes. Alchemists used the language of divine transformation to describe chemical reactions, speaking of the marriage of metals and the death and resurrection of substances in ways that drew directly on mythological narratives. Even early astronomers adopted mythological names for planets and constellations, creating a symbolic system that linked scientific observation with traditional storytelling. Perhaps most importantly, the philosophical interpretation of mythology established the principle that ancient wisdom could be preserved and transmitted even as surface beliefs changed and evolved. The myths did not have to be believed literally to retain their value as sources of insight into human nature and cosmic order. They could function as philosophical texts, psychological studies, historical documents, or spiritual guides depending on the needs and interests of their interpreters. This recognition that mythology could serve multiple functions simultaneously helped ensure its survival through the dramatic cultural changes that marked the end of the ancient world. As Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire and traditional pagan worship was suppressed, the myths of Greece and Rome did not simply disappear, but were preserved in new forms and contexts. The allegorical tradition that had been developed by pagan philosophers was adopted by Christian scholars who found in the ancient myths both negative examples of false belief and positive symbols of spiritual truth. The gods might be rejected as demons or false idols, but their stories could still be read as allegories for Christian virtues or warnings against Christian vices. Venus became a symbol of carnal love to be contrasted with divine love, while Hercules became a model of the soul's struggle against sin and temptation. This process of Christian adaptation and transformation ensured that mythological thinking would continue to play an important role in Western culture long after belief in the literal existence of the pagan gods had disappeared. The techniques of allegorical interpretation, the symbolic vocabulary, and the narrative patterns established by Greek mythology would profoundly influence the development of medieval literature, Renaissance art, and modern psychology. The philosophical rationalization of myth thus represented not the death of mythological thinking, but its transformation into new and more sophisticated forms. By recognizing that myths could convey truth through symbol and allegory rather than through literal narrative, ancient philosophers established interpretive principles that would allow mythological wisdom to survive and flourish in radically different cultural contexts. The gods might fade from active worship, but their stories would continue to speak to fundamental human concerns about meaning, morality, and the nature of existence itself. The transformation of the ancient world through the rise of Christianity marked what many historians consider the end of classical antiquity, but it was not the end of Greek mythology's influence on human culture and imagination. Instead, it marked the beginning of a remarkable process of adaptation and reinterpretation that would carry the wisdom and wonder of the ancient stories through the medieval period, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and into our own modern age. The gods of Olympus may have lost their temples and their worshippers, but they never truly lost their power to speak to fundamental aspects of the human experience. The Christianization of the Roman Empire in the 4th century of the Common Era created complex challenges for the preservation of mythological tradition. On one hand, Christian authorities often viewed the pagan gods as demons or false idols whose worship represented a dangerous threat to the salvation of souls. Temples were closed or converted into churches, statues were destroyed or hidden away, and the public festivals that had celebrated the gods for centuries were banned or transformed into Christian holidays. Yet at the same time, many Christian intellectuals recognized that the mythological tradition contained valuable wisdom that should not be lost. The allegorical methods that had been developed by pagan philosophers for interpreting myths proved perfectly adaptable to Christian purposes. Stories that had once been read as literal accounts of divine behavior could now be understood as symbolic representations of moral and spiritual truths that were consistent with Christian teaching. St. Augustine, one of the most influential early Christian theologians, developed a sophisticated approach to classical mythology that became a model for later Christian scholars. While he rejected the religious worship of pagan gods as spiritually dangerous, he argued that their stories could be valuable sources of moral instruction when properly interpreted. The myths could serve as negative examples of the consequences of sin and passion, or they could be read allegorically as symbols of Christian virtues and spiritual struggles. This approach allowed Christian scholars to preserve vast amounts of mythological material while transforming its meaning to serve Christian purposes. The story of Orpheus's journey to the underworld to rescue Eurydice became a prefiguration of Christ's descent into hell and resurrection. The labors of Hercules were interpreted as symbols of the Christian soul's struggle against temptation and sin. Even the love affairs of the gods could be allegorized as representations of divine love for humanity, though this required considerable interpretive creativity. The medieval period saw the development of increasingly elaborate systems for incorporating classical mythology into Christian culture. Medieval writers created complex allegorical encyclopedias that explained how every detail of the ancient stories could be understood in Christian terms. The Ovid Moralisé, a 14th century French work, retold all of Ovid's metamorphoses with detailed moral and spiritual explanations that transformed pagan stories into Christian teachings. This process of Christian allegorization was not simply a matter of imposing foreign meanings on ancient texts. Medieval scholars often demonstrated remarkable sensitivity to the psychological and spiritual insights contained in the original myths, finding genuine connections between pagan wisdom and Christian truth. Their interpretations, while sometimes strained or artificial, often revealed aspects of the myths that had been present from the beginning but had not been fully articulated by their original tellers. The preservation of mythology through Christian allegorization also helped maintain the literary and artistic traditions that had grown up around the ancient stories. Medieval poets like Dante drew extensively on mythological imagery and narrative patterns, creating works that combined Christian theology with classical literary techniques. The Divine Comedy, arguably the greatest poem of the Middle Ages, featured Virgil as Dante's guide through hell and purgatory, demonstrating how pagan wisdom could serve as a preparation for Christian revelation. The Renaissance marked a dramatic shift in attitudes toward classical mythology, as scholars and artists began to appreciate the ancient stories not just as sources of moral instruction, but as expressions of a sophisticated pagan culture that deserved study and admiration in its own right. The rediscovery of ancient texts, the development of more accurate methods of translation, and the growing interest in history as an independent field of study all contributed to a more nuanced understanding of what the myths had meant to their original audiences. Renaissance artists found in mythology a treasure trove of dramatic subjects that allowed them to explore themes of love, power, beauty, and tragedy with a freedom that purely Christian subjects sometimes did not permit. Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Michelangelo's Bacchus, and countless other masterpieces drew their inspiration from ancient stories while demonstrating how those stories could be reimagined through the lens of Renaissance humanism and artistic innovation. The mythological revival of the Renaissance was not simply a matter of artistic inspiration, but also reflected a broader cultural shift toward appreciating the achievements of classical antiquity. Humanist scholars like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola developed sophisticated philosophical systems that incorporated elements of ancient mythology alongside Christian theology, Platonic philosophy, and contemporary scientific discoveries. They argued that all wisdom traditions, whether pagan or Christian, contained aspects of a universal truth that could be discovered through careful study and synthesis. This syncretic approach to mythology and religion reached its culmination in the work of scholars like Giordano Bruno, who proposed that the ancient myths contained encoded scientific and philosophical truths that were only beginning to be rediscovered by modern thinkers. Bruno's radical ideas about the infinity of the universe and the plurality of worlds drew extensively on mythological imagery and ancient philosophical traditions, demonstrating how classical sources could inspire revolutionary new ways of thinking about reality. The Enlightenment brought yet another transformation in attitudes toward mythology, as rational critics began to analyze the ancient stories using the methods of scientific inquiry and historical scholarship. Rather than reading myths as allegorical teachings or artistic inspirations, Enlightenment thinkers tried to understand them as historical documents that could reveal information about the beliefs, customs, and social structures of ancient peoples. Scholars like Bernard de Fontenelle and David Hume developed theories about the origins and development of mythological thinking that attempted to explain how such stories had arisen in the first place. They argued that myths were essentially primitive attempts to understand natural phenomena, created by people who lacked the scientific knowledge necessary to explain things like earthquakes, eclipses, and seasonal changes. As human understanding advanced, they predicted mythological thinking would gradually disappear, replaced by more accurate scientific explanations. This rationalist approach to mythology had the paradoxical effect of both diminishing and preserving the influence of the ancient stories. On one hand, Enlightenment criticism undermined traditional beliefs about the truth value of mythological narratives, making it increasingly difficult for educated people to take them seriously as sources of knowledge about the world. On the other hand, the scholarly study of mythology as a historical and anthropological phenomenon helped preserve vast amounts of mythological material that might otherwise have been lost or forgotten. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought another major shift in attitudes toward mythology, as poets and artists began to appreciate the emotional and imaginative power of the ancient stories in ways that went beyond both Christian allegory and Enlightenment rationalism. Romantic writers like Goethe, Schiller, and Byron found in mythology a source of sublime imagery and profound psychological insight that could speak to the deepest concerns of modern humanity. The Romantics were particularly drawn to the tragic and heroic aspects of mythological narratives, seeing in them expressions of universal human experiences that transcended the boundaries of particular cultures or historical periods. The story of Prometheus became a symbol of human creativity and rebellion against oppressive authority. The tale of Orpheus represented the power of art to transform suffering into beauty. The journey of Odysseus embodied the universal human quest for meaning and identity in a chaotic world. This romantic appreciation of mythology was not based on literal belief in the ancient stories, but rather on recognition of their enduring psychological and artistic relevance. The myths were valued not as historical accounts or religious teachings, but as expressions of fundamental patterns in human experience that remained constant across cultures and centuries. This approach to mythology would prove enormously influential in the development of modern psychology, anthropology, and literary criticism. The 19th century also saw the emergence of comparative mythology as a systematic field of study, as scholars began to analyze the similarities and differences between mythological traditions from around the world. Pioneers like Max Müller and Andrew Lang developed theories about the universal patterns that appeared in myths from different cultures, arguing that these similarities revealed something important about the structure of human consciousness and the common origins of human civilization. This comparative approach led to the recognition that Greek mythology was not unique, but rather represented one particularly well-preserved example of a type of thinking that had appeared in many different societies throughout history. The stories of Zeus and Hera showed clear similarities to mythological narratives from India, Scandinavia, and other Indo-European cultures, suggesting common ancestral sources that dated back thousands of years before the classical period. The 20th century brought the most revolutionary developments in the understanding of mythology since the rise of Christianity, as psychologists and anthropologists began to explore the unconscious psychological functions that mythological thinking served in human life. Sigmund Freud's analysis of the Oedipus complex demonstrated how ancient myths could illuminate universal patterns in psychological development, while Carl Jung's theory of the collective unconscious suggested that mythological images represented archetypal patterns that were built into the structure of the human psyche itself. Jung's approach to mythology proved particularly influential because it offered a way of taking the ancient stories seriously as sources of psychological truth without requiring belief in their literal accuracy. According to Jungian analysis, the gods and heroes of mythology represented different aspects of the human personality, and their interactions symbolized the psychological processes through which individuals achieved maturity and self-understanding. This psychological interpretation of mythology found widespread acceptance among artists, writers, and therapists who discovered that the ancient stories provided powerful tools for understanding and expressing contemporary human experience. Joseph Campbell's work on the hero's journey identified universal patterns in mythological narratives that appeared in stories from around the world, suggesting that these patterns reflected fundamental structures in human consciousness and development. The influence of psychological approaches to mythology extended far beyond academic circles, shaping the development of modern literature, film, and popular culture in profound ways. Writers like James Joyce and T.S. Eliot drew extensively on mythological patterns and imagery in creating works that attempted to capture the complexity of modern consciousness. Filmmakers like George Lucas and the Wachowski sisters used mythological structures to create popular entertainments that resonated with audiences on deep psychological levels. The digital age has brought new possibilities for preserving, studying, and reimagining mythological traditions. Online databases make vast amounts of mythological material accessible to scholars and the general public in ways that were never before possible. Digital media allow for new forms of storytelling that can incorporate interactive elements, multimedia presentations, and collaborative creation in ways that echo the oral traditions through which many myths were originally transmitted. Contemporary adaptations of Greek mythology in literature, film, television, and video games demonstrate the continued relevance of these ancient stories for modern audiences. Works like Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series introduce mythological characters and concepts to new generations of readers, while films like Wonder Woman and television series like American Gods explore how ancient mythological themes can be adapted to address contemporary social and political concerns. The persistence of mythological influence in modern culture suggests that these ancient stories fulfill psychological and cultural functions that cannot be completely replaced by scientific understanding or rational analysis. While we may no longer believe that Zeus literally rules from Mount Olympus or that Poseidon literally controls the seas, we continue to find in these stories powerful metaphors for understanding power, justice, love, loss, and the other fundamental experiences that define human existence. The study of mythology has also been enriched by new theoretical approaches drawn from fields like cognitive science, evolutionary psychology, and cultural studies. These disciplines offer fresh perspectives on why mythological thinking developed in the first place, and why it continues to exert such a powerful influence on human behavior and imagination. Some researchers argue that the capacity for mythological thinking represents an evolved psychological adaptation that helped early humans cope with complex social environments and existential uncertainties. The globalization of culture in the modern world has also created new opportunities for cross-cultural mythological synthesis, as stories and symbols from different traditions interact and influence each other in unprecedented ways. Greek mythological themes appear in Japanese anime, African folklore influences European literature, and Native American spiritual concepts are incorporated into global environmental movements. This cultural mixing creates new forms of mythological expression that draw on ancient wisdom while addressing contemporary concerns. The environmental crisis facing the modern world has given new relevance to mythological stories about the relationship between humans and nature. The tale of Demeter and Persephone speaks to concerns about climate change and seasonal disruption. The story of Pandora's box resonates with fears about technological developments that may have unintended consequences. The myth of Icarus provides a powerful metaphor for the dangers of hubris and overreach in an age of rapid technological advancement. Educational institutions have also recognized the continued value of mythological literacy as an essential component of cultural education. Understanding mythological references remains important for appreciating classical and modern literature, art, and music. The metaphorical language derived from mythology continues to enrich everyday discourse, providing vivid ways of expressing complex ideas about human nature and social relationships. The therapeutic applications of mythological thinking have expanded far beyond the original insights of Freud and Jung, as counselors and therapists discover new ways of using ancient stories to help people understand and transform their personal narratives. Bibliotherapy programs use mythological texts to help individuals explore their own psychological patterns, while drama therapy techniques allow people to embody mythological characters as a way of working through personal challenges. Museums and cultural institutions around the world continue to mount exhibitions that explore the enduring appeal of mythological themes, demonstrating how ancient stories continue to inspire contemporary artists and thinkers. These exhibitions often emphasize the universal human concerns that mythological narratives address, showing how the same basic questions about meaning, morality, and identity that concerned ancient peoples continue to challenge modern audiences. The academic study of mythology has become increasingly interdisciplinary, drawing on insights from archaeology, linguistics, neuroscience, and many other fields to develop more sophisticated understandings of how mythological traditions develop, spread, and evolve over time. This scholarly work continues to reveal new layers of meaning in familiar stories while uncovering previously unknown mythological traditions from around the world. As we move further into the 21st century, it seems clear that Greek mythology and other ancient traditions will continue to evolve and adapt to new cultural contexts and technological possibilities. The fundamental human needs that these stories address, the search for meaning, the desire for heroic models, the need to understand suffering and loss, remain constant even as the surface features of culture change dramatically. The legacy of the gods thus extends far beyond the boundaries of ancient Greece or even classical antiquity. It represents a continuous tradition of human reflection on the deepest questions of existence, a tradition that has adapted to changing circumstances while preserving essential insights about what it means to be human in a complex and often mysterious universe. The stories that began in the chaos before time continue to speak to us today, offering wisdom, comfort, and inspiration as we navigate our own journeys through the labyrinth of modern life. From the void came chaos, and from chaos came everything. The gods were born, ruled, loved, and fell silent, but they have never left us. In every story we tell, in every question we ask about power, fate, or hope, we find echoes of Olympus. The myths are not gone. They are us. We have journeyed together through the full sweep of this remarkable story, from the first stirring of creation in the primordial darkness to the sophisticated reinterpretations of our own digital age. We have watched order emerge from chaos, seen titans fall and new gods rise, witnessed the birth of heroes and the founding of cities that would shape the course of human civilization. We have followed wandering ships across wine-dark seas and explored the depths of the human soul through stories that have never lost their power to move and transform us. Along the way, we have discovered that these ancient tales are far more than simple entertainment or primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena. They are profound meditations on the fundamental questions that every human being must face. What does it mean to be mortal in an apparently immortal universe? How do we find meaning in suffering? What is the relationship between individual desire and social responsibility? How do we live with dignity in the face of forces beyond our control? The Greeks who first told these stories understood something that we are still learning, that the deepest truths about existence cannot always be captured in logical arguments or scientific formulas. Sometimes truth requires the kind of imaginative leap that only story can provide, the ability to see in the particular experiences of individual characters the universal patterns that shape all human lives. Zeus may no longer hurl thunderbolts from Mount Olympus, but we still struggle with questions of authority and justice, power and responsibility. Aphrodite may not literally emerge from sea foam, but we continue to experience the transformative and sometimes destructive power of love. Odysseus may not sail on ancient seas, but we all undertake journeys of discovery that test our courage, wisdom and commitment to our deepest values. The monsters that Heracles faced in his labors still lurk in the shadows of our own lives, wearing different forms but representing the same fundamental challenges. The hydra of problems that multiply faster than we can solve them, the sphinx of riddles that demand creative solutions, the sirens of temptation that threaten to lure us away from our true purposes. The labyrinth that trapped the Minotaur still exists wherever we find ourselves lost in complexity, searching for the thread that will lead us back to clarity and understanding. Perhaps most remarkably, these ancient stories have proven capable of growing and changing with us, adapting to new circumstances while preserving their essential wisdom. The same narrative patterns that helped ancient Greeks make sense of their world continue to provide frameworks for understanding our own experiences. The hero's journey that began with Perseus and Theseus continues in the stories we tell about astronauts and activists, scientists and artists, anyone who ventures into unknown territory in service of something greater than themselves. The psychological insights embedded in these myths have proven to be remarkably durable. The Oedipus complex may be debated by modern psychologists, but the fundamental recognition that family relationships shape individual development in complex and sometimes painful ways remains central to our understanding of human nature. The concept of hubris, the dangerous pride that leads heroes to overreach and fall, continues to provide a powerful lens for understanding everything from political scandals to technological disasters. Even our most advanced scientific understanding of the universe contains echoes of mythological thinking. When physicists speak of the Big Bang, they are describing a creation story that shares important features with ancient cosmogonies. When biologists discuss evolution, they are telling a story about transformation and development that resonates with mythological narratives about metamorphosis and change. When psychologists explore the unconscious mind, they often find that the symbolic language of dreams and fantasies draws heavily on mythological imagery and narrative patterns. The digital technologies that define so much of contemporary life have created new possibilities for mythological expression and interpretation. Video games allow players to embody heroic characters and undertake epic quests that echo ancient patterns. Social media platforms become spaces where individuals craft personal narratives that often follow mythological structures. Virtual reality technologies offer the possibility of literally entering mythological worlds and experiencing their stories from the inside. Yet for all our technological sophistication, we continue to face the same fundamental existential challenges that confronted our ancient predecessors. We still struggle with mortality, meaning love, loss, justice, and the search for our place in a vast and often bewildering cosmos. We still need stories that can help us navigate these challenges with courage, wisdom, and grace. The enduring appeal of these ancient myths suggests something profound about the nature of human consciousness itself. We are storytelling animals, creatures who make sense of our experience by weaving it into narratives that connect past, present, and future in meaningful patterns. The myths provide us with a shared vocabulary for these narratives, a common set of symbols and structures that allow us to communicate about the deepest aspects of human experience. In our globalized world, where different cultures interact and influence each other in unprecedented ways, the mythological traditions of ancient Greece serve as one important strand in a larger tapestry of human wisdom. They remind us that despite our surface differences, all human beings share certain fundamental experiences and concerns. The same questions that drove ancient storytellers to create tales of gods and heroes continue to drive contemporary artists, writers, and thinkers in their attempts to understand and express the human condition. The study of mythology also teaches us humility about the limitations of any single cultural perspective. The Greeks created powerful and beautiful stories, but they were not the only people to grapple with ultimate questions or to develop sophisticated ways of thinking about existence. Their myths gain depth and resonance when considered alongside the wisdom traditions of other cultures, from the epic narratives of India and Mesopotamia to the creation stories of Native American and African peoples. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, from climate change and technological disruption to social inequality and political polarization, we can find in these ancient stories both warnings and sources of hope. The myth of Pandora reminds us that human curiosity and ambition can have unintended consequences, but it also assures us that hope remains even in the darkest circumstances. The story of Prometheus celebrates human creativity and the willingness to sacrifice for the greater good, while also warning about the costs of defying natural order. The cyclical view of time that pervades much of Greek mythology offers a different perspective on history and change than the linear progress narratives that have dominated modern thinking. Instead of assuming that change is always for the better or that newer is necessarily superior, mythological thinking encourages us to see patterns and repetitions, to recognize that some problems are perennial features of the human condition rather than temporary obstacles to be overcome through technological or social innovation. This cyclical perspective can be both sobering and comforting. It suggests that many of our current difficulties are not unprecedented crises, but rather new versions of challenges that human beings have faced throughout history. War, injustice, environmental degradation, political corruption. These are not modern inventions but recurring features of human societies that require constant vigilance and effort to address. At the same time, the mythological emphasis on heroism and transformation suggests that individuals can make a difference, that courage and wisdom and commitment to justice can change the world for the better, even if they cannot eliminate all problems permanently. The heroes of mythology are not perfect beings who never fail or suffer, but rather ordinary individuals who find extraordinary strength when faced with extraordinary challenges. The stories also remind us that meaning often emerges from struggle itself, that the process of facing difficulties with courage and integrity can be more important than achieving final victory. Achilles chooses a short, glorious life over a long, obscure one. Odysseus endures 20 years of hardship to return to his family. Heracles undertakes labors that seem impossible but ultimately prove transformative. In each case, the value lies not in the ease of the accomplishment but in the character revealed through the struggle. Perhaps most importantly, these ancient stories remind us that we are not alone in our struggles. The questions we face, the emotions we experience, the choices we must make, all of these connect us to countless generations of human beings who have walked similar paths. We are part of a vast human story that began in the darkness before memory and will continue long after our individual lives have ended. The gods may have retreated from direct involvement in human affairs, but their stories remain as powerful as ever because they speak to aspects of existence that do not change despite all our technological and social progress. We still need love and friendship, courage and wisdom, beauty and justice. We still struggle with pride and fear, anger and grief, the desire for immortality and the acceptance of mortality. In recognizing these continuities, we find both the consolation of belonging to something larger than ourselves and the inspiration to play our own part in the ongoing human story with dignity and purpose. The myths remind us that every individual life, however ordinary it may seem, participates in cosmic dramas of meaning and significance. We are all heroes of our own stories, facing monsters and making choices that matter not just for ourselves but for the larger communities and traditions of which we are part. The thread that Ariadne gave to Theseus still guides us through the labyrinths of modern life. The fire that Prometheus brought to humanity still burns in every act of creativity and compassion. The hope that remained in Pandora's jar still sustains us through our darkest hours. The wisdom of Athena, the courage of Achilles, the cleverness of Odysseus all continue to live wherever human beings strive to be their best selves in service of something greater than their immediate desires. And so the story continues, as it always has and always will, as long as human consciousness seeks meaning in the vast mystery of existence. The gods are not gone. They have simply changed their forms, becoming the values we cherish, the dreams we pursue, the stories we tell our children about what it means to live a life worth living. In every sunrise that brings new possibility, in every act of love that connects us to others, in every moment of wonder at the beauty and complexity of the world, the ancient gods still move among us. They are the immortal part of ourselves, the part that reaches always towards something higher and more lasting than the merely material concerns of daily existence. The myths endure because they speak to this immortal part, reminding us that we are more than the sum of our biological functions or social roles. We are conscious beings capable of creating meaning, beauty, and justice in a universe that offers no guarantees. We are storytellers and dream weavers, heroes and gods of our own small but significant lives. From chaos came cosmos, from darkness came light, from the void came love. The story that began before time will continue after time, carried forward by every human being who chooses to live with courage, wisdom, and hope. This is the true legacy of the gods, not the promise of easy answers or magical solutions, but the assurance that our struggles matter, our choices have meaning, and our stories will echo through eternity in the great song of human becoming. The ancient words still whisper in the wind. The myths are not gone, they are us,